The wind off the wall tasted of iron and old secrets. Snow rattled in the black crenels like 1,000 small bones. When Jon pressed his palm to the cold stone, he felt the pulse of something older than the realm, older than duty, older even than the name he had carried all his life. Ghost paced at his side, white as the drift and near silent save for the soft crunch of his paws. The direwolf's eyes were lanterns in the dark. "You're restless," Jon murmured, his breath ghosting in the air. "So am I." Ghost flicked an ear, as if to say, "I know." Behind Jon, the door's iron latch scraped. Torches guttered and caught, light draping along the passage. "Lord Snow," Ser Justin Massey called. The sound was crisp as hoarfrost. "His Grace will see you." Jon stared out one heartbeat longer across that bleak immensity. A lantern far below marked some watchman's slow patrol around the yard. The wall was a white cliff eating the sky. The realm depended on it, whether the realm knew it or not. He had sworn upon this ice. He had spoken the words and meant them. He turned, ran a thumb, gloved, along the scar on his palm from the day he had cut for the oath, and walked with Justin into the keep that Stannis Baratheon had claimed. Cold came inside with them. There was no stopping it. Stannis's fire burned low and mean, like the man himself. The king sat with shoulders straight, a map spread before him beneath river stones. A steel crown lay beside the inkpots. The room smelled of wax, charcoal, and damp wool. "My lord," Jon said then. "Your Grace." Stannis's eyes were blue, hard, and somewhat weary. They did not soften at Jon's courtesy. "You took your time." "My vows," Jon began. "Your vows were sworn to the wall, not to indecision," Stannis said. He tapped a finger on the map where a stag's brooch pinned the heavy vellum. "Here, Winterfell, the Boltons are carrion. They sit on a seat that is yours in all but law. I can give the law. I thanked you yesterday for the honor." "You thanked me and declined me," Stannis said, not unkindly, only precise. "And then you went walking in the wind as if expecting the old gods to whisper answers from their trees. If they did, I will hear them now. My time is not inexhaustible." "Stannis," the woman in the red gown said softly. Melisandre smiled with only the top half of her face. Below her mouth was a strict, red line. Flame rippled in the hearth and seemed to lean toward her. "He is snow. He will never be hurried." Jon kept his eyes on the king. "My vows bind me." Stannis's jaw worked once. "So does the North." He said it like a truth that needed no proof. Jon felt that truth like the slow collapse of something inside him. He thought of Winterfell's towers steaming after rain, of the thick smell of leather in the armory, of the godswood and the pool that held the world's face. He remembered his father's quiet voice and the weight of a hand that had known both law and mercy. "Your father raised you as his son," Stannis said low. "He may not have been able to call you so before the realm, but he did so in all that mattered. The North will answer to that. Wish it were otherwise if you must." "It isn't." "And the watch?" Jon asked. "Who holds it if I abandon it?" "You are not its commander," Stannis said. "You are a steward. I will not rip a Lord Commander from his post. The watch will stand as it has stood. More men can be sent. I have ships. I have provisions. I will not pretend that what breaks here can be mended with spells and seals. But neither can we pretend that your presence in black, on this ice, is the only line between night and ruin." "The line must hold," Jon said. "The line will hold better if the North is not ruled by flayed men," Stannis replied. "The watch needs a North that does not bleed itself dry in petty betrayals. I offer you what your blood warrants. In return I have your sword, your counsel, your name on my side when I call the bannermen. The wolf and the stag together. It is the only marriage I would gladly make that does not involve my own person." Melisandre's eyes had settled on Jon, luminous, as if pretending to see him without truly doing so. "There is more snow in my flames every day," she said. "More than can be accounted for by weather. I have seen you with a mantle of gray-green spreading to your shoulders. Wolf fur rimed in frost. I have seen shadows die at your feet. "Spare me your fire's gossip," Stannis said dryly. "Your grace will do," he added to Jon with a hint of self-mockery, as though to prove to himself he still possessed it. The door opened again. Maester Aemon stood framed there, small and bent, his blind eyes milk-white, one hand on the arm of Dolorous Ed who guided him. The maester's face was like old parchment that had been folded and unfolded many times. "Your grace," Aemon breathed, head tilted. "Forgive my boldness. I asked to speak to Jon Snow." Stannis nodded, impatient but not cruel. "And you have." "Alone," Aemon said. Melisandre looked amused, then made a small flourish as if to cede a stage. Justin Massey took himself to the shadows near the wall. Stannis looked at Jon a long moment, then turned to peer at the map as if the vellum too might offer counsel. The soft rasp of boots on rushes, the slow grind of Aemon's stick. Ed brought the old man closer and stepped back. "Come here, child," Aemon said, though Jon was no child. "I have known kings," the maester murmured, turning his face towards Stannis's presence. "I have known vows." His clouded eyes tracked back to Jon with a surety that could not be sight. "Once I told you to kill the boy and let the man be born. It was a hard counsel. It is harder still to let the boy live in one part of you and the man in another." His voice dropped. "Your oath was to the realm." "The realm," Jon said. "My oath was to the Night's Watch." "The Night's Watch was made for the realm," Aemon said. "Not the other way around. Do not mistake the tree for the forest. The forest is dark and vast. There are things in it that cannot be sung away. The North needs a Stark. I am blind, Jon, but not unseeing." Jon's throat went tight. "I will be called a deserter." "There are many names men will call you," Aemon replied. "Only some are true. Tell me this. If you had 10 hours to live, and in that time you could choose to save 100 men in black or 1,000 small folk in the lands below, whom do you save?" Jon did not answer. To speak might be to choose, and he was not sure if he had the courage to hear his own answer. Ghost came pressing against his knees. The direwolf's fur was chill and clean, smelling only of snow. It cleared his throat with a misery that was almost comic. "I have a knack for finding cheer where none exists," he said. "And even I can't find any here. If you break your vows, I'll never forgive you, M-Lord, until I do." The realm seems rather fond of being saved. Maester Aemon's hand trembled when it found Jon's wrist. "Kill the boy," he whispered, not for the first time. But now it was not a counsel to abandon softness. "Kill the boy who thinks only of his own honor. Let the man with the realm in his heart be born." Jon closed his eyes. Ned Stark's face rose up, a shape made of cold light and shadow. When he was very young and green, he had once asked his father if shame could kill. "A man is not what he feels," Ned had told him. "He is what he does." When Jon opened his eyes, he found Stannis watching him with a soldier's restraint. "Well?" the king asked. Jon felt the last of his breath leave him and new breath flood in, as if he had stepped underwater and endured something he had feared and been remade. "Your Grace," he said, "I accept your offer." Even Melisandre looked surprised then. Stannis let one corner of his mouth tick. "Good," he said, and nothing more. "Kneel." Jon knelt on the hard rushes, Ghost beside him. The king's hand was warm and dry as iron that had been held too long. He lifted his steel crown and placed it lightly upon Jon's head, then touched his shoulder with a sword that had ended traitors and outlived honors. "In the name of the king, I, Stannis of House Baratheon, do here by letters patent and royal authority declare Jon Snow of Winterfell, born of Eddard Stark, legitimate in blood and style and name," Stannis intoned. "Rise, Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North." The words were a hammer. They drove something deep into Jon that rang true and terrible. He rose because the king told him to, because ghosts do not rise but men must. Ed scrubbed at his eyes with a sleeve as if removing smoke. Maester Aemon smiled like a child who had tasted honey. Melisandre's gaze burned, not with triumph but with a fiercer, more private satisfaction, as if a game had moved closer to its end. The snow in my flames takes a shape, she murmured. Get your cloak, Stannis said. We march south before the next storm pins us here. Justin, you will draw up letters. Send them to the northern houses with ravens. Say what must be said. The wolf is restored. Your grace, Justin said. And Ghost? Ed asked softly. Jon put his hand in the direwolf's ruff. Where else would he go? The watch watched him leave. No words were spoken from the top of the wall, where a dozen dark shapes stood like crows perched on a rope. No arrows chased him. Bowen Marsh folded his hands and hid his mouth. Alliser Thorne's eyes were knives that had been sharpened by every slight and every moment Jon had bested him in front of men. He did not draw steel. He did not need to. The stabbing would be done by words later, Jon suspected, when they wrote their histories. At the yard's gate Samwell Tarly waited with a look of mingled pride and terror. And Jon knew the look because it was the look he had worn when he first went into the woods beyond the wall with a sword he hadn't yet earned the right to carry. Sam opened and closed his hands as if they wished to hold something heavier than air. Is it done? He asked dumbly. Jon did not trust his voice. He nodded.
Sam blinked.
Then the North will have a Stark again. He shuffled his feet. We are thinner for losing you, Jon. I will be back, Jon said, and knew he could not promise it. The watch will have what it needs. Provisions. Men. I will see to it. You always do, Sam said. What will you do? Jon asked. Read, Sam said, almost offended by the question. And then his mouth twitched, and he leaned forward and hugged Jon in a clumsy, solid mess of wool and resolve. Right, learn, live. The world never runs out of things to be afraid of. I thought that would mean one must be afraid forever. But I suppose it simply means one must keep going forever. Be careful, Jon. They broke apart. The gate groaned. Snow fell in small, insistent skeins. Ghost went first into the white world beyond the black timbers, fur mottled with flakes, his head low to the scent of the night. Jon followed, and behind him came men with banners stitched hastily with a stag and a wolf twined, and the watchman who kept this gate closed from habit and fear shut it with a thud that echoed too long. The march south began as marches always do, with the silence of men saving breath and muscle for what could not be hurried. They followed old frozen tracks along the new gift where abandoned crofts crouched under snow like beasts sleeping badly. The trees were black spears thrummed by wind. They passed one little field where the snow had been swept away in a neat circle and a low hearth of stones built, new. A few bits of charcoal clung in the cracks. Jon dismounted and crouched there, pressing a hand to the stones. When he straightened, his face was drawn hard. Free folk, Stannis said behind him. His tone turned the words into an accounting of property that had gone unclaimed too long. Your friends. They are people with bellies, Jon said. And children. They run because air is nowhere to go forward and they know better than to go back. Give them a place to stand and they'll stand in front of the wall, not behind it. Stannis grunted. Where? The lands between the wall and the Umber country, Jon said. Let them settle the abandoned holds. There are too many empty halls in the new gift. And if that offends the watch, then make it royal land under your authority. They can take your insult to their pride to the nearest tree and hang it. Stannis almost smiled. If you mean to talk me into what I already want, you could simply say so. I need strength for my war. If they will kneel. They won't kneel, Jon said, but they will swear in their way. We need not demand from them what they cannot give. Oaths are not so brittle that they shatter if they are not cast in gold. Speak with the Magnar of then when you see him, Stannis said. He understands orders. I will speak with many, Jon said. They found the tents of Thens and Norreys and other free folk where snow-wrapped hides gleamed like the backs of whales and men with pale hair braided with bones watched them coolly. Tormund Giantsbane stood clear of the others, his beard full of frost, his eyes bright as if seeing a jest behind the next snowdrift. He grinned when he saw Jon, then scowled for the form of it. King Boy, he boomed. Or is it Wolf Boy now? I can't keep your names straight. I have counseled my people to keep to the woods rather than to trust wooden doors that may slam in their faces. What will you give us? His grin returned. Besides your pretty teeth. Fire, Jon said, and a place to use it. I offer your people the abandoned holds. Lands till spring for as many as can till them, and steal if you fight. Fight for the realm, not against it, or fight the dead when they come. There is not much difference. They always come, Tormund said, but his voice dipped low. He looked at Ghost and then at Jon's face. You mean it? Yes. Then by the seed of my seed and the snow in my beard, Tormund said, suddenly solemn. We have an understanding, the then as well. Especially the then, Jon said. I would have their walls like squares placed in the north instead of circles thrown against it. He did not wait to savor the small victory. The march turned west to the high, bleak country where the mountain clans had made their homes since before the first Baratheon had ever heard of the north. At a narrow pass cut between knife ridges, men lean and brown as bark stepped out from behind stones with bows drawn and the small, clear eyes of foxes. The wool's standard hung limp in the snow-choked wind. They looked to Jon as if trying to peer through skin. A man in a patched cloak of sheepskins stepped forward and spat. The spit froze before it hit the ground. Who are you? He demanded. Jon pushed his hood back and let the snow fleck his hair. Jon Stark. The sound went through the assembled men like the faint stir of crows on a far field when a shadow passes overhead. The sheepskin man's mouth worked. He had a nose that took up too much of his face and a scar that stole one of his eyebrows. Say it again, he ordered, as if to be sure a trick had not been played on his ears. Jon Stark, Jon said. Ghost moved forward, silent, and stood at Jon's knee, eyes red and steady in the white world. It was as good as a seal had ever been. Eddard Stark's blood. Ha! A man with a beard down to his chest snorted. And I am the sun come down to drink a cup of snow in the wool's hall. What proof? Demanded another. Jon drew Longclaw. The Valyrian blade drank the color of the light until it seemed a piece of night that had taken shape. This was Lord Commander Mormont's, he said. It was given to me. I have no parchment to show you, no pretty seals. But I will come to your hall and break bread with you, and I will listen to your grievances, and I will stand by you when you stand by me. Because I am the son of the man who did so before me. If that is not enough, it will have to become enough once I have proven it. There are silences that feel like a missing step in the dark. This was one. The mountain men looked at one another. In their world, bread and bone meant more than wax ever had. The sheepskin man's mouth twitched. You look like him, he said grudgingly. Too soft by half in the jaw. But the eyes are the eyes of a man weighing beans and lives in the same hand. Let him come. We will see if his stomach can take our stews. They came into the clan halls with their low roofs and smoke-blackened beams, drank the soups that tasted of hooves and unraveling winter and listened long. Jon promised little he could not do and much he could, and in the end when he left there were men who came behind him in pairs and then in bands, and old great-grandmothers who put a hand on his sleeve and grunted and said the world had not finished itself after all. He slept badly on furs that smelled of fox and grew used to the way Ghost vanished and reappeared like a thought half-remembered and half-feared. In the midst of the moving and the swearing and the slow, exacting negotiation of a realm that had been half left for dead, a girl with hair like black thread and a face sharp with hunger slipped into the camp and asked for Jon Stark by name. She wore a boy's cloak and a knife at her belt and clutched a bundle that she would not let any man touch. When she was brought to him she bowed as if she had learned of bows out of books. Alice Karstark, she said. It all came together in Jon's head like a knot being pulled tight. He sent for hot broth and bread and listened, and when she had told him of her uncle Arnulf and the way Karhold had turned into a trap with smiling jaws, he sat very still. Do you seek sanctuary, my lady? I seek a Stark, Alice said, and her shoulders went back the way they might have if she had had a dozen men behind her instead of the weight of all that had been taken. Oh, speak for our house as it once was, not as my uncle would have it. Arnulf means to marry me to his son. After that, a fall off a tower or a cup that does not taste of wine. My brothers are dead. My father is dead. My house is not. I will not have it said that Alice Karstark ran into a snowbank and hid there while wolves finished the bones. Your brothers died fighting for Robb, Jon said. They died because they were young, Alice said. And because none of us were as clever as we thought. Will you help me, Lord Stark? I came to the wall because I heard that you had some part in speaking sense to the free folk and making peace where there was none. If you do not want me, I will slit Arnulf's throat at his own high table and flee. I would prefer not to have to do any of that. Jon's first thought was of an old god's tree with red leaves and a face carved when the world was new. His second was of Mance Raider's people and the way promises could be bent into bridges if one was careful and strong. Have you heard of the Thens? He asked. I have heard they eat the dead and the living and prefer the latter, Alice said primly. They do not, Jon said. But they like walls and order. Their leader is agreed to fight for us. He needs a place to stand. You need men who will stand for you. If you wed Sigorn, Magnar of Then, you would make Karhold something that could not easily be taken, from within or without. Old blood, new stone. Alice looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were winter light on water. At last she nodded once. I will wed him, she said. If he is not a brute and smells better than an old goat. He smells like a new goat, Tormund called from the shadows, and laughed when Jon threw him a look. The wedding was spare and strange, under a heart tree that knew Jon's father's voice and did not care about southern septons or parchments. Snow fell softly like ashes shaken from a god's fire. Alice's jaw was set and Sigorn had the look men get when they are trying to stand taller than themselves. They spoke simple vows about standing and protecting and sharing, and the old gods witnessed because they always do. Jon tied a strip of Alice's cloak to Sigorn's with a knot his fingers remembered from the first time they had tied things that mattered. And when it was done, Alice's shoulders eased as if a weight had been taken and not simply moved. She drank the black bark wine they had brewed from tree sap and grinned and wiped her mouth with the heel of her hand. Now, she said, we will see if Arnulf likes the taste of his own trap. News moved in the north like a bear through deep snow, slow and with much huffing, but it moved. By the time Stannis's host, hard-eyed knights of the Queen's men, northern clansmen with their odd, proud small banners, free folk in patched furs, and the ragged leavings of Southron men who thought glory tasted the same everywhere, curved west toward Deepwood Motte, ravens had landed in halls and kitchens carrying the name that meant old debts must be paid. Some men wept when they opened those letters. Others swore old oaths into new cups. A few spat and burned them. Jon had expected all of this. He knew the North's stubbornness because he had lived under it all his life. He preferred men who spat first and marched later to those who smiled and waited. Deepwood Motte huddled in the forest like a dog with its back against a tree, bristling and teeth bared. The Ironborn had carved their presence into it with the cruelty of orphaned men. The outer palisade was rimed with ice beneath salt-stained shields. Torches burned sullenly. Night fell early and full, and in that dark Stannis laid out a battle that was neither subtle nor foolish. He had Massey's men come round the back through the deeper snow where woods would hamper any defense, while the clans came in low and quick, and Jon asked to lead the assault at the gate. Hungry for glory? Stannis asked. Hungry for home, Jon said. Stannis heard something in that and nodded. They went in with the snow in their mouths and smoke in their eyes. The Ironborn fought as if the world were a drowning deck and there was no point in mercy, and the North met them with the cold that made cruelty wasteful. Jon found himself on the wall with ghosts leaping and snapping and men falling in that graceless way men fall from high places, and Longclaw a black tongue flicking in and out of the world of light. He did not kill for pleasure. He killed because men fought him and he needed to pass, and because a boy who had once watched his father's sword fall had learned what happens if you let a man live because you prefer not to see what his eyes become when he dies. When the gate was taken and the longhouse doors smashed in, Jon found Asha Greyjoy with hair like night-swept iron and a laugh that sounded like choked fire, backed against the hearth, sword held low. She appraised him and the dire wolf at his side with something like wry respect. Stark, she said, and she put down her sword without argument. I think I'd like to keep my head. A shame, Tormund said later, disappointed, when they counted the captives. They always plead so pretty when they beg me to let them keep it. Sybil Glover wept when Jon put the house's keys in her hands, and the sound cut him deeper than any iron. Little Robert Glover's wife had kept the place with limited men and unending will. She had spent nights on her feet telling herself in whispers that her daughter would see this hall again. Now she bent her forehead to Jon's knuckles and whispered something so low he did not catch it. He squeezed her fingers and told her he understood. He did not. He would try to. It seemed enough for now. They warmed in Deepwood, and the storm rolled over the forest like a thing with a mind. News still ran. It reached White Harbor, where Lord Wyman Manderley, wider than any chair built by men, voice like war drums muffled by wine and grief, sat in his great hall beneath painted mermen and listened to Stannis's letters and stared at the name that had uncoiled from the paper like a winter river. "Jon Stark," he said, and put the parchment down very carefully. "It is too late for some. It is not too late for others." His banner at the front of his procession when he rode to meet Jon's envoys at the Wolf's Den flew high and clean. He was flanked by men in blue and green and white, and he wore rings that could have been thrown at cats. He knelt with difficulty because of his belly and the old wounds that had made him slow and shrewd, and his eyes were bright with tears and cunning both. "My lord," he said, and it was good to hear the words in that hall. "Winterfell's men will always have bread in White Harbor." He feasted the wolf and the stag that night with a richness meant to prove that the sea did not always devour what was placed into it. Writers who had not seen a Stark in 2 years wrote the letters that would go out to every corner. At some point, after third course and before the pie, Manderley took Jon into a small room hung with tapestries so old the threads had become memory and said, "The boy from Winterfell has grown into a man who knows what it costs to look at a map." "It costs the amount of a men's lives," Jon said. "It costs that," Manderley agreed. He leaned forward until his many chins made a shelf for his smile. "I am with you, my lord, but I will say what old men must. There is another Stark. I have it on certain whisper that a boy with dark hair and a dire wolf that would bite the moon lives on an island of cannibals. I do not say this to turn your supporters. I say this because the North is a stubborn horse that will buck until a true heir sits it. When that day comes, be ready to stand for him the way we stand for you now." Jon exhaled. This was not news he had never imagined hearing, not a surprise so much as a returning tide. "If my brother lives," he said, "I will keep his place warm." "And keep his enemies cold," Wyman said, cheeks dimpling. "Good. We are agreed." Davos Seaworth was not in that room. Wyman did not yet trust Jon enough to show him his most private pieces. But in the morning a ship put out from the Manderley Quay with a lean, grizzled man on it who carried more honesty in his missing fingers than many men carried in a lifetime's smiles. The ship's hull took the gray sea the way knives take bread. The North, then, moved on several boards at once. Stannis's camp grew in the bleak field where the snow lay in layers like white parchment and men's breath smoked like ink. He tested the lines of every lord who came to him and found some too slack and some too taut. He took counsel from men with less right to it than they thought, and dismissed men who should have been listened to longer. He was as he had always been, exact, unyielding, not unwise. Jon did not ask him to become someone else. He took what he needed from what Stannis was and built the rest from ice and necessity. The banners that came to Stannis's camp were strange and dear. Mormont's black bear on green, the tall pines of the Hornwoods, little houses with names remembered long and less. The Umbers sent men with white hair like horses' tails, whose laughter made men look to their throats on reflex. Lady Barbary Dustin came and smiled thinly and said she was with them and meant she was with herself. Jon marked her and kept his counsel. Every pledge brought food or information, fewer brought both. Wools and Norreys and Littles stood with the Queen's men around smoky fires where there was always a pot that smelled of onions and bone. Jon moved among them until he could hear the shape of the North's heart in its talk. Its rhythm was stubborn and cold. It would serve. Someone brought news of Winterfell then. Roose Bolton had made a seat of meat and fear there. Ramsay had wed. Arya Stark's name floated over the walls like a banner, and it made men look to Jon. He had learned to take the weight that their eyes put on him and bear it. "If it's Arya," he said, "we bring her out." Tormund hawked quietly and then spat, missing a tent peg by an inch. "Bolton's hounds will run for that scent. He enjoys making a chase of it." "He enjoys it," Jon said, "until he learns that wolves hunt too." He found Melisandre that night standing alone in the snow as if she had been planted there and had grown. The world took light from her instead of giving it to her. For a moment he tried to think of her as a woman who felt cold in her fingers and warm at her throat. Then he let the thought go. "You burned Mance Rayder in the yard," he said. "No," Melisandre said. Her gaze went to his face and away, as if following some line in the distance that he could not see. "I burned a man who wore Mance's face. It was kinder to the realm to let the crows think their pride had been avenged. I sent the true Mance south upon a different road, with a lute and a different name and certain knives hidden in his songs." Jon did not let his mouth open. The snow seemed suddenly too bright. "You sent him to Winterfell." Melisandre's smile sharpened. "Your sister's name has power." "My sister's name," Jon said, and made himself shape the word around this twisted truth. Jane Poole's face came to him through rumors like a shape underwater. "There is a girl," Melisandre said. "Names are like cloaks. They can cover. They can be stolen. They do not change the weather. All my fires show me is this: a dark girl in a white hall with a broken thing in her heart. The man you call bastard has used her name for a hook. If you would fetch the fish, stop worrying if you have the right rod." "Does Stannis know?" Jon asked. "He knows enough," Melisandre said. "He thinks of winter, not of girls. You think of both. That is why you are needed, Lord Stark." Jon slept that night in a tent that had grown too small for the thoughts that needed to move there. He dreamed of Winterfell's godswood and tea. His slow drip of water from ice under the red leaves. He dreamed of Ned Stark, eyes as gray as the weather, sitting on the edge of the pool and saying nothing until his silence drew truths out of Jon like fish drawn to crumbs thrown on still water. In the morning he went to Stannis and said he needed men. Stannis looked at him with a rough angle of approval. "There is a column of Freys near Barrowton," he said, pointing at the map. "Go around them. Be quiet. Mance will be somewhere where songs can enter. Fetch the girl. Bring me Ramsay Bolton's pride in a sack." He went with men who knew snow. The Norreys moved like shadows that belonged to another world. A handful of Queen's men came because they had friends they wanted to impress with tales later. Tormund came because he liked the way danger made food taste. Ghost ranged ahead and brought back silence. They saw Winterfell's first smoke by midday and its walls like the white bones of an animal that had died standing up by twilight. Mance Rayder, near enough to touch the well in Winterfell's yard and call it by a different name, was not named Mance. He was Abel, a singer with fingers that knew strings and a smile that came rarely and poorly. He had gathered women who had learned to fit knives into places men did not search because they thought women were mostly bone and prayers. Those spearwives moved through the back halls like servants whose faces no one looked at. Their songs carried messages. Their smiles paid for escape. The man named Abel sang a song about a rose in winter and looked at a boy who had once been called prince, then captive, then something less than a man, and saw that the boy's eyes remembered a gray girl running laughing across a yard, and saw that his jaw clenched where men clench to keep themselves from falling apart. The boy was Theon Greyjoy. He helped the girl jump from a wall into the storm, telling his bones that this was not falling apart but coming together. He told her to run, and she ran as if the snow might choose to open and swallow her. They nearly died a half-dozen times before they had taken 20 steps. When they came out from the storm, Ghost appeared like an old story. He put himself between them and a world that would break them. Jon lifted the girl. She was small and scarred where no man had ever had the right to make that ugliness, and held her as you hold something that has already been dropped too often. Theon, hands raw and eyes more raw, knelt in the snow and did not ask for mercy. He laid his neck before the man whose brothers he had betrayed, whose home he had taken, whose iron sword he had broken without breaking any part of himself that mattered. Jon looked at him a long time. "Get up," Jon said at last. If you want justice, you will live to see it. Theon's breath left him in a cloud that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. I do not want justice, he said, voice shredded. I want to stop hearing my own voice in my head when the wind blows. You'll hear it for a long time, Jon said, and marched them through the night to where Stannis's men held the line like a narrow boat in a wide river. The storm made war of its own on that field. It ate torches. It broke horses. It laid men down and did not let them rise. Stannis, who disdained the gods whether they were red or leaf-crowned, cursed at the way his army had become little islands in a white sea and made his virtues from anger and stubbornness. We will break them, he told Jon, before the snow breaks us. He did not break the Boltons. He broke the Freys first. The Crofters' village near a frozen river became the mouth of a trap that Stannis's mind had set and the storm had baited. The Freys came laughing into the White, and the White took their horses' feet out from under them, and men who had never liked them much to begin with were already tightened to spring. When Hostine Fry went down, he looked surprised in a way that would have made kings pity him if there had been any kings left to do it. Jon was in the thick of it, Longclaw moving as the snow moved, slow and necessary. He kept Theon behind him and put the girl wrapped in a cloak between two stout Mormont women who, between them, had more scars than any Sellsword and better stories. When men shouted, "Stark!" someone took up the cry for real rather than for derision, and then many did. Sound gathered under the storm's hiss. Sound mattered. Men stood taller when they had sound. Roose Bolton did not come. He watched from Winterfell and made small calculations behind his small, careful mouth. Ramsay did not watch. He paced and cut and shouted, and when he slept he smiled as if powdered sugar had been sprinkled across his dreams. He sent men out to harry, and Stannis had them before they had time to turn or repent. When the storm broke, the field was a map of harm. Crows came to trace black lines on white parchment. Men whispered that the lake where the Freys had been caught would stink come spring. Jon did not care for the Freys' spring. He cared for the road to Winterfell and the men he had and the food he did not have. He cared for the way the North's eyes had turned toward him. It was Manderly who brought the tipping stone. Wyman had sent men into Winterfell on one pretext and another, and had in his hall boiled ribs, and offered the Boltons' friends the fat of the land, and then buried pieces of them in pies. In Winterfell he played a slower game, but the effect was the same. He whispered where to stand and when. He said when to trip over lines that had been drawn carefully. He smiled when a gate did not close as quickly as it ought. He laughed when snow softened a rope. When the hour came, it needed little drama. Jon Stark rode in through a postern gate at dawn with 100 men who made little noise and every movement count. Above him he saw the broken tower he'd climbed as a boy and the windows he'd looked out when he had been kept from bread at supper for SP. Eking sharply at a lord's son. Winterfell smelled of smoke and old stone and something sour. He pushed those memories down into his boots for warmth. The yard was quiet except for dogs. Ramsay Bolton came out with half his face pink and half white, as if he had stepped from a bath and forgot to rinse the blood away. He had eyes like blue rum and a mouth that adored the taste of its own words. He smiled broadly at Jon. "Brother," he said, "welcome home." Jon did not indulge him. He advanced. Men moved to meet men. Ghost hit one of Ramsay's men full in the chest and worry left Jon's head. There was nothing in the world as pure as a direwolf doing the work he was made to do. Ramsay tried laughter, then speed. He had the latter only in talk. He cut poorly, as men often do who imagine that hurting is the same as fighting. The yard filled with quick, ugly decisions. Roose Bolton remained a piece on a table he imagined he still controlled. Jon kept looking for him and could not find him until the shape at a far balcony bent to peer with interest at the world beneath. A man's hand came up from behind him and cut his throat. He died neatly, with a resigned expression, as if the meal had been of acceptable quality but never truly to his taste. Lady Barbary Dustin wiped her blade on the fur at her collar, and her mouth was thin as a wound. She met Jon's gaze and smiled as one queen to another king at a tourney field where someone else had already arranged the outcomes. Ramsay saw his father's blood and stared as if the idea that men died had arrived to him late. He ran for the kennels. Men screamed as dogs. He did not set ghost on him. He cut him clean and quickly, and when the head rolled the courtyard watched the fall in silence. Afterward there was much to do that was not glorious. The dead must be counted. The living must be sorted into those who would stand with the north and those who would be sent to hold back the night on the wall and those who would be buried in nameless trenches. Men cleaned blood with cold water and wool cut from good blankets and cursed at the waist. Women went from room to room to make sure that no doors hid girls who had learned to be quiet so well they would never speak again. Manderley's men brought out 2 Freys in chains and tossed them into the snow casually, like offal. Wyman smiled and later sent them to the gods the way he had others. His cooks worked with a particular concentrated joy that day. JON had the household gather in the great hall. He stood beneath the banners that Robb had once hung and that Roose had taken down and that he had put back up again, and tried not to look like a man who had almost wept when he touched the ring Ned Stark had placed on the carved wolf's head years ago. The hall breathed out and in, full of eyes. The girl who had worn his sister's name sat on a bench with a thick Mormont cloak around her and stared at her hands as if they were new. Theon sat beside her with his back straight and his head tipped as if listening for a tune he might recognize. "You have no lord today but the North," JON said. "If you are from Dreadfort or Hornwood or White Harbor or Bear Island, if you are a Manderley or a man who took all you have from the sea with your hands, you have no lord today but the North. You have no house stronger than this hall. If you stand here, you stand under Winterfell's roof. If you cannot bear that, go now and take your leave." No one moved. "I am Jon Stark," he said. He let the name rest in the air like a careful weight. "I am your lord if you will have me. I am your sword if you need me. I am your shield even if you do not ask. I will keep the laws that have kept you. I will break what must be broken to keep you alive. If you serve me, serve the North. If you defy me openly. I do not care to hunt wolves in my own hall. I will accept the fealty of those who give it and the honesty of those who withhold it. But understand this, we are not finished with war. There is one on our doorstep that has never cared for our oaths." Later, when the hall had poured its allegiance into him in 100 small ways and one great shout, when men had knelt and cried and smiled and become masks of their own hope, JON went to the godswood and knelt in the red light and laid his hand on the old weirwood's rough face. Ghost lay beside him, one ear twitching. The moment the bark was under his palm, the world fell away. He felt the slow, cold-burning pulse of the tree. He felt the small movements of tiny white things under the snow. He felt time like a tide under ice. He spoke to the tree as he had spoke, and to his father when the man still lived, and as he had spoken to himself in the silent times. "If I have done wrong, let me set it right by what I do next," he said. "If I have done right, let me bear the cost." He felt no answer, only the sense that the tree had seen too much to be impressed by this small ask and too much to deny it mattered. Winterfell settled into the new arrangement the way old bones settle into new weather, with aches and familiar complaints. JON restored, repaired, did not yet rule so much as steadied. He set men to stone that had been charred and wood that had been cut. He ordered the kennels cleaned out and the kitchens inspected for rancid stores and the old underground's entrances marked and guarded. He set Alice Karstark and Sigorn on their way to Carhold with a letter sealed with grey wax bearing the sigil of the dire wolf and words that promised shelter and wrath in equal measure. He sent ravens to the Night's Watch offering grain from the Bolton stores and men from the winter town to help repair the shattered outer palisades. He sent a letter to Sam that said nothing of the things he did not dare write and a great deal of the things he dared not leave unwritten. He sealed it and found, to his surprise, that his hand did not shake. He named men to posts, to Ser Robert Glover because he would have torn his own beard out if left idle. He gave the task of writing to the scattered houses to return and rebuild. Glover took to it like a starving man to stew. To Wyman Manderley he entrusted a watch on the road south to Barrowton. Manderley made jokes about sending his legs and then sent 200 men who did not laugh, which was better. He asked the Mormont women to hold the winter town and sent grain there. They did, with a relish that made him smile until he remembered that they had buried too many men to be anything but hard. Queen Celis wrote frost-lettered missives from the wall and demanded proofs that men were breaking their idols and turning to the Red God. JON returned a careful letter of thanks for King Stannis' authority and another that asked for obsidian and iron and any men who had less pride than hunger. Melisandre wrote nothing. He sometimes felt her eyes like warmth on the back of his neck and told himself 1,000 times that warmth is not always welcome in winter. The nights lengthened and seemed to find new inches more of dark as they did. When the first raven came down from the north with a leg pearled with ice and a message tied to it with black thread, JON took it himself and broke the seal. The message was spare. Men of the watch. Whites at the woods beyond Eastwatch. Pushing back. Need men. Need fire. He went to the hall with the paper in his hand and read it aloud. It was not a long speech. He set it down on the table and looked at the men who had survived so many old wars that they had begun to find ways to feel at home in making plans for new ones. "We begin moving fire north," he said. "Dragonglass where we have it. Oil, pitch, torches. Men who know how to make fire behave. We do not empty Winterfell. We do not invite ruin. But we do not let the watch bleed alone." Stannis stood at the other end of the table and weighed him with a look that had little praise in it and much acceptance. "I will send Massey south to gather more men and more horses," he said flatly, as if this had always been part of a plan he had kept in the sill of his mouth. "The South does not know what winter is. I will show them with letters and with coin. I will have sellswords who want to be loyal for at least as long as it takes them to weigh the other side. The Queen will keep the wall for now. I will keep the north with you." "Your Grace," JON said. It was a cold night that sent the second raven and the third and the fourth. It was a colder night when a plain, ugly ship with a ragged sail came up the white knife under a sky so bright with stars it was hard to remember that many of them were probably dead. Men came to the quays with torches, and their lights made the river look like a snake with small hot eyes. A lean man in a faded cloak walked down the gangplank with the caution of someone who has learned that the ground under him can tilt. He had a mouth made for grimaces and a face that spoke truth as if it were a habit rather than a virtue. Beside him, leashed in a way that made the idea of leashes look foolish, came a black wolf with eyes that ate light, and behind them both a boy with hair like a dark storm cloud and a grin like a hook pulled out of the tide. Rickon Stark's grin vanished at once when he saw Winterfell. He stared at the broken towers and then at the banners that told lies no longer. Shaggy Dog sniffed the cold and bared his teeth in a smile that had no humor in it. The boy shivered, but he did not step back. He was smaller than JON had tried to remember him, then larger, a collapsible thing like time seen through tears. Davos Seaworth bent his head to JON. "My lord," he said. He did not bother with more. He smelled of salt and rope and a promise kept over too long a road. JON looked at Rickon and could not find the words he had used easily in the hall each night, to soothe men's pride or raise it, to give shape to a realm whose old shapes had been broken by too many rough hands. He went to a knee because he could not do anything else without shaming himself. Rickon stared at him, perhaps measuring him against a memory that had been eaten by wolves and winter and time. Then he rushed the last steps and collided with JON as if he had been thrown. "You're bigger," Rickon said, muffled in JON's cloak. "You smell like the yard." He looked up and his mouth curled. "I have a wolf." "I see that," JON said thickly. "I have one too." Shaggy Dog growled at Ghost. Ghost did not growl back. He stepped forward and pressed his nose to Shaggy's in a soft greeting that made the men watching shift on their feet because they had forgotten. The world had such things in it. Winterfell's hall saw a feast that night that tasted partly of celebration and partly of relief so strong it was like the ache after a wound has been lanced clean. Wyman Manderley ate as if to prove a point. The Mormonts toasted with sour smiles. The men of Bear Island made obscene jokes about the size of the direwolves. Alice Karstark sent a letter of congratulations on parchment that smelled of old stone and new goats. Stannis ate with his jaw set and his eyes like flint tips in a fire. Davos drank little and talked less. He watched JON and his eyes were more full than some cups. Later, when the noise had curled into corners like old cats and the candles had gone to sleep, Jon stood alone in the crypts beneath Winterfell and let the cold there remind him of a boy who had come often to these stones because he had needed to find himself in a place where names did not tremble when he said them. Ned Stark's statue was as he remembered and not. The stone eyes looked over his head at something that neither father nor son would see. Jon put a hand on the sword laid in stone beneath the stone fingers. "Father," he said. He let the word burn its course along his tongue. "Now what?" When he came up, Melisandre was waiting at the top of the steps. Her face was lit like something carved shallow and painted bright. "He is a boy," she said, "and not the one my fires showed me." "He is a Stark," Jon said. "He does not need to be the one your fires showed you. He must be himself." "So must I." Melisandre inclined her head. "So you echo your father." She lifted one hand. A thin ring of smoke curled around her wrist and vanished. "And the other?" "What other?" Jon asked, tired. "The one whose blood runs under yours like a river under a frozen lake," Melisandre said, and smiled at the way his face hardened. "I do not need to say a name. Names make men cowards. You have work to do. The boy will be a symbol. The man will be the knife." Jon watched her go into the darkness and did not ask for more. The world was already loud with enough prophecy. He made it easy, in the weeks that followed, to ease the north toward a shape that would not splinter at the first hard push. He sat in high seat and low, listened to a dozen small causes and one or two great ones, sent men to fetch timber and men to plant sprouting barley in barrels indoors and men to start digging pits for the making of charcoal because there would be forges to be fed. He sent riders to Last Hearth with letters that he hoped the Umbers would read with more humor than rage. He took counsel from Davos and Tormund, from Wyman and Robert Glover, from Little and Norrie. He wrote to the Eyrie but knew better than to expect answer. Sansa lived somewhere hidden in that world of gulls and clever men. He forced himself not to think of her beyond what he could do for all the poor daughters who had no names in the songs. The Watch's ravens kept coming. Eastwatch had seen movement along the shore. A group out of Hardhome had vanished. A patrol between Queensgate and Castle Black had come back with 2 fewer men and 1 unquiet body that had burned for a night and a day. Queen Celis wrote that the Red God would protect them if they repented their old gods. The old gods answered by putting their faces back on every tree between the wall and the Dreadfort. Jon rode north with 200 men with layered cloaks and layered loyalties and met the Lord Commander. Bowen Marsh had learned to wear the title like a shirt that fit badly, and said he came to offer help and not to demand obedience. "The Watch does not bend the knee," Marsh said, immediately bending his tone. "The Watch accepts bread," Jon said, and had carts unloaded with rye and oats until the yard stank of hot horse, and the men could not remember the last time they had seen so much grain in one pile. He stood atop the gift's low rise and stared out at the forest that never ended. He felt the cold bite his lashes and felt the old fear wake and stretch. Ghost was not at his side. He had gone ahead, silent as drifting ash, to see what the snow might be hiding. He returned with his fur salted with frost and his eyes the color of old blood. He lay his head against Jon's knee and whined, and Jon's hand clenched in the rough fur and did not let go. The Watch's horn sounded once, then again. Men turned their heads, then their bodies. Torches raised. Stannis's men found their helmets. The men of the free folk, who had thought they knew all forms of moving white, felt the hairs on their necks realize they were still attached to something worth saving. They came out of the trees with the quiet of a thought you wish you hadn't had. The whites moved badly and with purpose, a wrongness in their limbs that had nothing to do with frost. The others behind them were a different matter. They skimmed the snow as if they did not dare touch it and had goaded the world into letting them pass. Their spears glittered like children's dreams made into weapons. The cold they carried made the night cry out. Jon lifted Longclaw. The breath of the men beside him thickened until it seemed each man had 2 souls fighting in his chest for dominion. "Fire," he said. It went out along the road like a spell in reverse. Pitch, oil, torches lit and thrown. Men muttering not prayers but instructions that had the tone of something that might pass for faith if the gods had been practical men. The first ranks of whites took fire and kept moving because there are many ways to die and this was only one. The other's blades kissed men's swords and splintered them as if mocking the effort it had taken to forge them. The first of them came yawing down on a then whose face set as if he were walking into wind and snow and a wind that could walk. Jon stepped to meet it because the body moves toward the worst thing when your mind is full with it. Longclaw caught the pale spear. For a moment there was a sound Lee. Ku, a frost-covered branch given a sudden twist. The other's face did not change. It had never been a face. It had been a set of gestures men made when they think of winter's bones. Jon put his shoulder behind the blade and pushed. The other slid back as if on glass. Behind Jon, a man shouted as if something had cut him in the throat and all that was left was what leaked out. The line broke in 2 places and then held, then threatened to break again. Davos put men where they needed to be with the quiet authority of someone who had stood against storms that did not care if their names were remembered. Tormund laughed a terrible laugh that made fear look over its shoulder and run. Men who had been enemies 2 weeks ago put blades and hands and backs together until they were one thing, raw and unhandsome and sufficient. When the first other shattered under Longclaw's edge, it did so without drama. No scream, no complaint, just a collapse into powder and a sound like breath finally let go. Jon almost choked on the smell of it. Snow and something old. He pivoted to meet the second and found himself smiling because if the worst thing can break, then anything can. It was not a good smile. There was nothing good in the world just then beyond the short, brutal usefulness of men doing what they had sworn. At the end, the field looked like a board a child had kicked over. Men panted and discovered where they were bleeding. The whites on the ground didn't stop moving until they were cut apart and burned in pieces, which exhausted everyone in new ways. The others vanished without ceremony. They did not leave footprints. They left a rumor that the dark had hands. Jon stood very still and then his legs shook. Ghost leaned into his shins hard, as if to remind him of gravity. Davos came to him with soot on his face that made it look as if someone had tried to erase him and failed. "My lord," he said, "you're not dead. That's a detail I'm fond of." "Nor you," Jon said, and then he was laughing or sobbing. He could not tell, and Davos was shaking in the same confused way, and men who had never thought to clasp hands with fishmongers or bastards found their hands doing it anyway. When it was done, Jon wrote to Stannis about what had stood at the Treeline. He wrote to Wyman Manderley that the pies must be hot and the steel ready, and the men told that what they fight now does not sing when it bleeds. He wrote to Sam and told him that the old books could be wrong and also the only thing between them and death. Then he went to Rickon's chamber. The boy had fallen asleep in his clothes with Shaggydog's head half under the bed and his feet sticking out like hairy steps. Jon looked down at the solemn mess of him. He sat in the chair by the bed and rested his head against his fist. Ghost lay down, patient and heavy. When Rickon woke, he saw Jon and did not start. He simply shifted the way boys do around men they want to grow into and said, "Is it true that you killed a man made of ice?" "It's true that I killed something," Jon said. "Killing is not the point. Standing is." Rickon nodded solemnly. "Will I have to kill one?" Jon thought of 1,000 ways men had tried to save their sons, from lies and from truths. If he comes to your door and asks for bread, you must refuse him. If he comes again, you must refuse him again. If he breaks your door, you must stand with a knife in your hand and know how to use it. Rickon nodded again. He did not look frightened. He looked like winter. The next day, Jon called his council with more purpose than form. Stannis was there, stiff and iron, and Melisandre, watchful and unbreathing, and Wyman, whose laughter came like a wave against stone and did not always break, and Davos, who spoke and men listened because the road had put truth in his voice that no title ever could. Tormund dropped crumbs and swore and said things that made the finer throats at the table tighten. And the men of the mountain clans leaned on their elbows and knew that they belonged the way stones belong in a wall. "There will be no peace with the south while the knights are chewing holes in our fields," Jon said. "We secure this land. We set the free folk to building. We place more men along the wall where it can be held and fewer where it cannot. We send for any iron we can melt and any fire we can carry. We make Winterfell into a mouth that can eat fear and swallow it. We do not march on the south until the north can march as one. We do not play the Game of Thrones with men whose hands are empty of wood and full of parchment. We are done with parchment. Stannis nodded slowly. You speak as a head of house, he said. Try to remember that vows on paper bind more than fire sometimes. My claim needs time. Your claim needs more time. We will give them both what they need if we live. We will live, Jon said, with the ignorance of the brave and the weary. Because there is no other way. He put men where they would do good. He sent letters carefully to men who had not yet decided to love him, and did not forget to feed those who had already given him their bellies and their swords. He walked the halls where he had once run. He stood many nights at the top of the broken tower, feeling the wind's long fingers comb the hair off his brow and the cold's hard teeth on his skin. Ghost came up behind him as often as not and set his jaw on Jon's wrist in the old way he had when he had been a pup who learned what flesh meant. Jon would scratch lightly between the ears until Ghost's eyes slitted with a pleasure so mild it might almost have been prudence. He wrote to Sam of Dreams. He wrote to Sam, I have been named Stark. It sits ill and well in turns. It is a wine that I drink that tastes of my father and of choices not mine to make. He wrote, Does honor survive when the night is full of enemies who do not know what honor is? He wrote, The swords of the first men were not made to swing forever. We must new ones. He wrote, I remember the look on father's face in the yard on a morning in which the sky smelled of rain and he watched Arya climb and did not call her down. Perhaps that was his rebellion. Perhaps mine is building a world that can carry a name rather than polishing the name to a shine while the world slips from beneath it. Rickon walked at his side, sometimes with steps that turned into hops when he thought no one looked. Shaggy Dog and Ghost paced in an uneasy companionship, one too quick to bite and one too slow to do so without reason. Theon Greyjoy walked in the yard every day, slower than one would wish, faster than one should expect, shoulders growing gradually toward something that might one day be a line rather than a bend. The men watched him with a calculus in their eyes. The sum came out different for each man. Jon kept the counting to himself. He had to be unjust sometimes, and he was in ways that made him take the long way to the godswood. He had to be merciful often, and that was worse. He did not find time to be happy. There were moments that seemed to wish to become happiness, but they drifted away like breath on cold air and were gone. When the second great push came from the north in a night wind that screamed like horses, they were ready in the ways that mattered. Fire stood in great pits. Oil sat in clay jars that shattered and made any man with sense run. Men stood in pairs and trios so that if one fell the others would bring him up. The free folk fought as if each corpse they burned had once had the name of someone they had known, and perhaps it had. The thens held a line that did not bend because it did not know how. The Queen's men prayed loudly and then shut up and fought so quietly you barely noticed until you saw the bodies at their feet. Jon went through the night making the small shifts that can turn disaster into something else. Not victory exactly, but survival with teeth still in the jaw. He killed 3 others with Longclaw in an hour. He almost died from a spear he never saw but for the way Ghost leapt so high and so fast that the world had to blink to keep up. Tormund caught him by the collar when the ice beneath him cracked and said if he died by drowning Giantsbane would piss on his grave forever. At dawn men wept, which is proper when you greet the sun in a world that has tried to eat you. Melisandre stood on the wall and looked out toward a line only she could see. Stannis turned his face south long enough to remember what pride felt like, and then north again, as if he meant to conquer even this. Winterfell, Davos said, fitting the glove on his stump, feels more itself with you in it. It feels itself, Jon said, looking at the sky that had come back for now. The self may not be me. Davos looked at him sidelong. I've misliked lords all my life. You I don't mislike. That might be the highest praise I have. He cleared his throat. The boy now, he's meant for this seat. Jon nodded. The words did not cut. They confirmed. I will carry it until he can. You might have to carry it further than that, Davos said, gentle. You might have to carry it until the seat matters less than what it looks at. Jon laughed, once. It sounded like something breaking that needed to be broken. When I became a boy again, I'll let you know. He thought of Catelyn Stark sometimes, and the colder parts of her, the parts that had learned to live with a husband in love with his honor and a house built on secrets. He did not blame her for the way her kindness had been measured and her cruelty easy. The world does not always let women choose the temperature of their mercy. He wondered what she might have said to see him sit in Ned's chair. He thought she would have disliked it and then grown used to it and then found a way to make it useful when the time came. He thought of Rob often. He kept that thought close as a cut that had scabbed but never healed. He thought of Rob's careless, good laughter and the way he had labored to look like a king as if the labor were the same as the look, and he felt no cruelty in the memory, only a brother's raw love. He thought of Arya and could not bear it for long. He thought of Sansa and wished her somewhere safe and warm and full of words that she chose. "You hold your head like father," Rickon told him one day accusingly. "Do I?" Jon asked. "Yes," Rickon said. "You look at people as if you already know the bad thing they did and you don't mind much. You only wish it had been a better bad thing." Jon smiled, for the first time in days with something that reached his eyes. "I will watch my head. Watch my dog," Rickon said, more serious. "He eats candles. Then he will shit light," Tormund said cheerfully from a bench and was thrown out of the hall for an hour for the happiness of it. When spring came, and it did not come so much as a truce, a slight slackening of the snow's insistence, the fee a winter charges for the right to speak about later, it was with the sound of ice breaking on roofs and the smell of old mud. Men stood in sunlight like deer. Women folded their hands in a way that said they had allowed themselves to believe in this hour but not later ones. Jon took off his cloak and stood in the yard and let the air touch his neck. That night, the letter came from the south written in a hand that had never done a day of honest work. It spoke of kings and castles and lines of inheritance that meant more to the men who wrote them than to the men who killed to keep them. It asked for the North's fealty. It threatened if it did not have it. It named Stannis an oathbreaker and Jon a traitor and Rickon a puppet and the free folk beasts and the Night's Watch an irrelevance. It was signed with a lion and a rose and several other flowers which seemed to Jon to be fading on the paper even as he looked. Jon let it lie on the table while he poured himself wine he did not truly want. He took it up again and drew a line through everything that did not matter, until what remained was the line that did. The living had asked for iron and fire. The dead had obliged them. The South's quarrels would have to wait. He wrote back a letter that was spare enough to stab. Then he went to the yard. He called his men. He set watchers on the walls. He went to Rickon's chamber and took a storybook down and read badly until the boy fell asleep with his head in Shaggy Dog's ruff. He went to the Godswood by himself and sat under the tree until his back ached and his legs cramped and his heart steadied. When he rose, Ghost rose with him. Together they walked out into the slow, cold dawn. A raven flew low. Jon lifted his eyes to it and thought it looked like a scrap of night that had been torn and forgotten. He smiled without mirth for a world that forgot nothing and forgave less. He put his hand in Ghost's fur and felt the thrum of life there, thick and stubborn. He thought of the boy he had been and the man he had become and the men he had killed and the world he could not save and the world he could. He went on then, along the wall walk, past men whose eyes had learned to find him in any light. The stones remembered his steps. The air knew his breath. The banners moved as if they had been waiting. "Lord Stark," someone called, and the words did not feel like a lie. He did not look away from the edge of Winterfell's wall where the land went out into white and then into green farther than sight. "I," he said simply, and it was enough for now. The rest would come. It always did. The night came later, and with it another raven, and with that raven a name for a storm that had gone to sea and turned itself into knives, and with that men's fear. Jon slept badly and woke to something like hope hammering in his chest with a stupid rhythm, as if he were a boy and the world had not spent him yet. He laughed quietly at himself in the gray by the window and thought perhaps it was not hope. Perhaps it was only life arguing its case again and refusing to lie down just because men had asked it to. "Come," he told Ghost, and the direwolf turned and followed him, a white question at his heel, and in answer Jon went where he was needed, because the North needed him still, because the wall did, because the first men to stand there had not cared for the names of the men who would come after them, only that they came. The house would stand until the boy could hold it without the man's hand. The realm would stand if men fixed their eyes north as often as south. The wind off the land tasted less of iron that morning. It tasted of wet bark and far smoke and the meat of the day. Jon drew breath as if it might be his last, not because death was close but because life was, and went down the stairs 2 at a time into a hall where bread steamed and men argued and a child laughed and the old gods watched from their leaves in the courtyard and a red woman watched from her own strange fire and a blue-eyed king measured the world against himself and found it smaller than his will. Jon stepped into it all, the noise and the work and the quiet truths. He did not look behind him. He did not need to. Ghost was there and the north. He had taken a name. It had taken him back. He would make of it something a boy could grow into and not drown. He would make of it something a man could hand away without falling apart. The rest would come. And when the next horn sounded from the north, when it woke men from their beds and drew them to their boots, when it rolled along the wall like a pebble cast into a pond whose edges no one had yet seen, Jon Stark was already on his feet, already on the move, already measuring the day by the men he could save. The vow was the same, whatever cloak he wore. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. He smiled at the thought because the old words had never stopped being true. They had only changed their garments. He drew Longclaw. He touched the pommel as if greeting an old friend. "Ready?" he asked, and the men around him made the small rough noises of people who were. Rickon stumbled in, hair a-snarl, Shaggydog's grin sharper than ever. Stannis stood with a line in his mouth that meant resolve rather than rage. Wyman leaned on his stick and smiled as if he had been expecting this all along. Davos loosened his shoulders and shook his head with a resigned joy. "Ready," they said. The sound of the horn faded, and into the space it left stepped the wind. It came cold and certain, and the men went out to meet it, and the boy with the dire wolf grinned like a fool, and the lord with the long blade set his hand on a rampart's old stone and felt it solid under him, and the north remembered what it had always known. That names were good to rally behind, that banners were good to see from across a field, but that in the end it was men in the snow who kept the dark from crossing the distance between the tree line and a child's bed. Men with fire in their hands and vows in their mouths and fear in their bellies and the stubborn decision to stand anyway. They stood. The day broke and broke again, and they did not. The night fitted itself over them like a hood, and they did not bow. The world made its argument in cold and iron, and Jon Stark answered it with a blade and a voice and a patience learned on a wall of ice where vows had first put a shape to his life. When the candles burned low and the last orders had been given and the last whimper of the wounded had faded into exhausted sleep, he finally allowed himself to take one long breath in the quiet and taste the new snow that had begun to fall. Taste it clean. Ghost put his head against his knee, and Jon's hand found the spot behind the ears without looking because some paths learn you as surely as you learn them. He sat with his back against the old stone and closed his eyes. The realm's noises reached him, dull as boots through deep drifts, then clearer, then quiet again. He could hear, he thought, the slow iron heartbeat of a people remembering their courage. He could hear the faintest scrape of old gods turning their faces. He could hear the small quick breath of a boy asleep beneath a wolf's guard. He opened his eyes. Morning was beginning again. That, at least, would not end. He rose. He went back to work. By noon the sky had gone the color of old pewter and the flags on Winterfell's ramparts sagged under a rim of melt. Jon stood at the high table and let the hall fill the way it liked. In noisy ripples, men and women pressing close to where old smoke had embedded itself in the rafters. Hearth fires hissed where snow from cloaks had been shaken just short of the flames. Hounds slid under benches like shadows with bones. The smell of stewed onions and hot bread made thinking seem indulgent. Rickon sat to Jon's left on a carved chair that had been brought down from a dusty stair closet, smaller and crooked. Wolf heads gnawed smooth on the ends by boys whose names had fallen out of memory. He wore a gray wool surcoat that made him look too young and bluntly sure. Shaggydog sprawled where the dais steps ended, his tongue lolling out between teeth that looked newly sharpened. Ghost lay by Jon's boot and watched Shaggy watching the hall. Between the two dire wolves a space had opened as if instinct demanded it. They had eaten, they had drunk, they had told old stories and a few new ones, and now the hall had that held-breath quality it gets when men are ready for something to be decided and are terrified of the deciding. Wyman Manderley leaned on his oaken cane and tried not to smile, but his mouth couldn't quite keep from wanting to be a harbor. Robert Glover had tugged his beard so hard it looked plucked in places. The Mormont women sat like carved bears, fists on knees, heads slightly forward as if listening to the world through the stone. Stannis Baratheon stood at the end of the table and looked at the assembled North like a man inspecting soldiers' boots. His face offered nothing. Davos was a pace behind his king, eyes weighing the room and finding where it leaned. "What is law," Stannis had said an hour ago in Jon's solar, voice pared to the bone. "I made you with my hand and my seal. I will not unmake you because the air is full of tears. The realm is not a farmhouse where a boy sits in a chair because his father did. And the North is not a ledger," Davos had said, cautious. "It remembers in a different way, your grace. He is not unmaking your gift. He is placing it where it will gather men rather than drive them off." Now the room quieted. Jon set his hands flat on the table and stood straighter, as he'd seen Ned Stark stand when the right words were heavier than a sword. "I was made Lord of Winterfell by the king," he said. He did not raise his voice. He carried. "I accepted because the realm required it. The realm still requires the North to be one thing. Today it can be." The hall shifted like a ship finding wind. "I am Lord of Winterfell," Jon said, letting the words exist just long enough to be real and then stepping out from under them. "Until Winterfell's true lord is ready to sit his father's chair. That day is today if you will have it. Rickon Stark is Eddard Stark's son, trueborn, our blood. I set aside what was given to me so the North can answer to itself." A sound started in the back, someone dropping a cup, and then another, someone choking on surprise, and then ran through the hall in a warm shudder. Relief, like a hurt exhaled. Manderley's cheeks glistened. One of the Mormont women said a word that sounded like a curse and a prayer. Tormund, who was there because he refused to miss a moment when men were honest, slapped the table so hard a trencher jumped and fell, and a dog snapped it out of the air. Stannis's mouth became a single line. He did not speak yet. He didn't need to. The silence around him said any word he'd speak would be the clean edge of a blade. Rickon was already standing. His eyes met Jon's, and in them Jon saw a boy who had lost his mother and his father and his home and had found a wolf and a hard core where something else might have gone rotten. "If the North wants me," Rickon said, not loud, not small, "I'll be who I should, until I'm taller. Jon sits next to me and tells me what I'm not seeing." "You'll never see everything," Jon said softly. "No one does." "Then I will stand," Rickon said, "exactly where I can see most." They had no ice to lay in his lap. The great sword had been melted on an anvil far from this cold hall and turned into other men's names. Jon had found an iron band from an old chest, beaten into a circlet and polished until it took on a dull, stubborn sheen. It was not a crown. The North had never loved crowns. He lifted it and set it on Rickon's brow, where it looked too heavy and then did not. The boy's jaw settled. Shaggy Dog growled like a drum. Ghost didn't move. One by one the houses came. Wyman sank to both knees, which was not theatrical so much as unavoidable, and spoke of bread and sea and the debts that had piled up salted and hard. The mountain clans came and touched the boy's shoulder, as if ensuring that the boy was not smoke. Barbary Dustin approached with a face you could have put a blade edge on. "The world turns the color of old meat," she said. "And then sometimes for a moment it looks like a field after rain. I have no interest in rain. I have interest in the field." She touched 2 fingers to her brow in a gesture that belonged to no maester's scroll. "Stark." Stannis waited until the last had spoken and then said, "The boy sits because I say it. Do not fool yourselves that a child on a chair is a law. Law is a sword that must be held. Jon Stark," he spared Jon the look a moment longer, "is my warden and protector of the North until this boy is of age. A king's word wrote it so. You will find me stubborn in matters that matter." Then, as if annoyed by his own concession, he added, "If I ever wish to be loved, I will find a cat and a bowl of cream." The laugh that ran through the hall then was relieved and a little ragged. Men stamped. Women nodded with their mouths tight. JON knelt to Rickon with no difficulty in it, the kneel a statement rather than a posture. And men saw and were quiet, and something old clicked into place. There was stew enough that night for memory to have a flavor and ale enough to wash down pride. The old gods in the courtyard watched men become a shape again. After, when the hall had melted into small clusters and the candles had guttered into their cups and the rushes had begun to smell of days that had come before, JON climbed the tower that had lost its top and stood where the wind had always liked to be. The night tasted of thaw and smoke. Ghost came and leaned his weight into JON's shin. Below, the forge rang as if it had decided to work through the dark to get a small jump on dawn. "You gave it easily," Stannis said behind him. JON had not heard him climb. The king's breath smoked and his gloves made a soft complaint against stone as he set his hands to the parapet. Men who hand over power with a smile either mean to get it back with a knife, or they never wanted it. "I wanted it," JON said. He did not need to make his voice bristle about the truth. "I want much. Wanting is not the same as deserving, or being needed." Stannis grunted. It might have been approval or indigestion. "The North will call you. Some will call the boy. Some will call no one but their own small gods. You will be patient with them. I will not." He turned his head slightly. "When I sent Davos to find the boy, I was preparing for a day in which I would break you to this chair. I am not blind. Your stubbornness is more useful where it is. Davos told me to let you stand where men could see you and realize they needed you there. I find I dislike being told and grateful for it in the same breath." "Then we are alike," JON said, because he would not flatter this man and would not waste time on false humility. "I have letters to write. Arnulf Karstark still breathes. He should not do so long. I would send Alice and Sigorn with men enough to make Karhold stand and then bow." Stannis's mouth went harder. "Karhold will stand. Whether it bows politely or has its knees broken first is not much interest to me. Make it so. Your free folk lord with the ringlets." "The Magnar," JON said. "He has no ringlets. All these Northmen are one hair or another and none matter," Stannis said impatiently. "Sigorn, let him be in front when the doors of Karhold open. I want every man who thought to make a wife of a girl by force to see who holds her hand when she steps over her own threshold." JON did not argue. "White Harbor ships can be spared for Eastwatch," he said. "Hardhome is full of ghosts that are not yet dead. If we can pull any of them from the shore, we must." The Watch's ravens speak of fire needed more than words. "You have the sea?" Stannis asked, startled into interest despite himself. "Wyman Manderley has the sea," JON said. "He will give me some of it. Ask, do not tell him," Davos said lightly from the stair, where he had chosen to stop and listen rather than intrude. "He gives more when it is his idea. He gives most when the idea makes a pie of someone he hates," Tormund called up from the yard, catching the drift with that odd free folk sense of when to put himself near humor. "If you can promise him Frey's drowning at Hardhome, he will put oars in your mouth." Stannis sighed like a man surrounded by cousins at a wake. "Do what you must, and write to Queen Celis," he added with reluctance that had been aged in his bones. "Tell her what to do in words she cannot mistake, and then be prepared for her to mistake them. She will not burn a child without my word. She has been known," Davos began, stopped, chose a different path. "The Queen's men are hot for wood. There are too many trees near the wall for their comfort. They could be rash." "Send Val," JON said. "She knows the wind up there and where it stings. She will tell me if rash becomes ruin." "Send Tormund with her," Stannis said dryly. "She will tell him more than she will tell you, and he will tell you more than any letter will." "I am still here," Tormund bellowed, amused. "You can say my name without pretending I am a stool." The next day the yard became message and map. Riders left at first light for Karhold with Alice Karstark wrapped in a cloak of gray-green wool and iron at her hip and her hair pinned up with bone that had been polished by her aunt's meanness and was now polished by new purpose. Sigorn rode beside, his thens behind in two neat lines that looked like they could cut stone simply by looking at it. Before she went, Alice took Jon's hands hard and said, "Do not forget me." "They will not. I would rather my house remembered that you had my back than that you wrote me pretty words." "I will remember you," Jon said. "Do not let your uncle see your fear. If you have none, borrow some from someone who does and hide it." She grinned, quick and unpretty. "I have enough for 10 men. "Then keep it," he said. Wyman Manderley sent down to the Wolf's Den for ships with prows that had known teeth and river ice both. His letters were heavy with ink and humor. "If you drown in my boats, my lord, I will fish you up and drown you again in better." He sent his fleet's second with Davos standing on the quay watching ropes coil like old snakes. "This is folly," the knight said, cheerful. "And all good things begin there." Val arrived at Winterfell wrapped in snowy furs and disdain. She had hair like white gold dragged through winter light and a look that took the measure of the women around her first and then men. She stood at the gate and looked up at the towers and made a small sound in her throat like a person encountering a bear that has slept in her bed. "You Southerners build too many corners," she said to Jon when he came out to greet her. "Corners trap wind. And men. We build corners to turn our enemies," Jon said. "You'd do better with a clean field," she said. Her eyes went to Rickon, who had pushed past Shaggy Dog and stood peering at her with all the insolence of a child who has lived through too much to be patient with courtesies. "Your boy lord looks like he would bite." "Sometimes he does," Jon said. "Good," Val said. "I do too." She glanced past him. "Where is the Red Woman? I will not stand where she can see me and say I was unworthy in her fire. She has set her eyes on the wrong stars." "Melisandre is at the wall," Jon said, and Val's mouth pulled to one side. "Then I will stand at a distance and tell your queen to mind her fire. She can burn her own hair if she wants smoke." Val tilted her head. "You have not asked for my hand for yourself like the last crow did. I like you better already." "I don't need a wife to bring me the free folk," Jon said. "Only a friend who will tell me when I am being a fool." "I'll tell you," Val said. "You won't like it." She jerked her chin at Tormund, who had been loitering near enough to hear. "And I'll tell you when he is drunk." "You won't like that either," Tormund said, delighted. They rode for Castle Black 3 days later with a small escort and a speed that made even the horses displeased. Jon left Winterfell in Wyman Manderley's bulk and Barbary Dustin's sharp tongue, with Robert Glover's fingers sunk into the North's small knots. Stannis remained in the castle with the air of a man who has set a stone on a table and dares the table to move. Rickon made a face and hid it badly. "I can come," he threw over his shoulder, trying for nonchalance and hitting only hope. "You can't," Jon said, gentler than the shape of the word. "Hold Winterfell. If I die, you will have to hold it twice as hard." "I won't let you die," Rickon said fiercely, as if that were a thing he could declare and thereby make true. "Good," Jon said. "Hold me to it." The road north felt shorter than it had when he had ridden it away from his old life, likely because his life had grown heavy enough that lightness felt like speed. Ghost ran and vanished and came back and touched his knee as if checking that Jon was still a thing. The skies were less mean than they had been, but the cold remembered its business. They came upon a burned tree 2 days shy of the wall, black from root to broken limb, around which men had posted small, careful prayers cut into bark with knives. Queen's men stood there with the toneless patience of people who do not expect to be liked and have chosen defiance instead. Jon reined in and looked.
"Val," he said.
Tormund spat, tore a heart out of a weirwood and made it a torch, Tormund said, disgust sharp. "They'll wonder why the crows go wrong in the wind from here out." "It is not the heart tree," one of the Queen's men said, standing too straight. "A sapling was felled in honor of the true God. Her grace has decreed." "Her grace will undecree," Jon said, and did not raise his voice. "There is wood enough in the north without burning gods you do not understand. You have torches. Don't make torches of what does not belong to you." He looked at the weirwood stump a long moment. "You carry iron, and those who carried the trees carried stone in their mouths. Your iron breaks quicker than stone breaks. He nudged his horse. I'll write it for your queen. She can put her seal on it. She likes seals. Val laughed, short and pleased. Castle Black rose black and stubborn against the white. Jon felt his throat tighten as he saw the familiar scatters of men in the yard. The patchwork repairs to walls that had never been meant to withstand men so much as winter. The gate opened, grudging, and Queen Celis came out to meet them with red on her shoulders and frost in her mouth. Shireen followed 2 steps behind, face half hidden in a scarf, eyes large and bright with the joy of seeing anything new. Lord Stark, Celis said by way of greeting, investing the name with the exact amount of disapproval she felt fit to give it. You return to us after having been made much of. I will not pretend I think your choice was holy. I don't need you to, Jon said evenly. I need you to keep the watch fed and to refrain from burning their gods. Men who will fight for you are better than men who must be kept from fighting you. She went thin-lipped but said nothing. Melisandre stood behind her, bright and unblinking, like a painted saint who had lost her halo and did not need it. She tilted her head at Jon in a greeting that felt like an examination. The winds carry 3 voices from the north, she said. One is white, one is black, one is not a voice at all but a length of silence with teeth. You have come to fail or to be made. That is always the choice. Do not speak to me of choices as if you invented them, Jon said. Where is Maester Aemon? In his bed, Celis said. His breathing rattles like a prayer wheel. He cannot abide my chaplain. That is not unusual. He will die soon. It will save him from error. Jon turned on his heel and walked. He did not rush. He moved with the speed inevitability lends a step. Men stepped away. He heard the littlest of footfalls behind and to the side and glanced down to find Shireen walking to keep up, small and determined. My lady, he said. My lord, she breathed, pleased to be spoken to as if warmth were a thing you shared with words. I read your name in a book once. It was not your name. You were a boy. I was, Jon said. He put his hand out for a moment as if to steady the girl over a seam in the wooden hall. Something in the way her hand hovered above his and did not land made him furious with a world that taught children to be careful where they should not need to be. Your father fights. He does it well. Does he? She asked as if such a thing were myth. He does, Jon said. He stopped at Aemon's door. His knuckles on the wood were quieter than they had been on a helm short hours ago. The room beyond smelled of floorboards that had learned the shine of old oils and of a man's thin breath. Maester Aemon lay under furs that had been shaken and smoothed 100 times by careful hands. The old man's chest rose shallowly. His skin was translucent as if it admitted light unwillingly. Shireen, at the doorway, sank to a stool and put her hands very carefully on her knees, like a girl who has learned that if she is careful enough nobody will ask her for anything. Ghost lay down with his head on his paws and did not growl or cry or make any of the noises men make at endings. It was one's great shadow that filled the doorway for an instant, and then withdrew with an ungraceful reverence. They burned Aemon on a pyre made of wood that had not come from a god's wood, under a sky that had as many holes as answers. Sam's voice caught twice and he let it catch and continued. Melisandre watched with eyes that looked as if they had found some color in the flame that men had not named. Queen Celis stood with her jaw set and her lips moved, counting sins. When the flames had turned Aemon into something that memory could carry, men turned back to the world that would not wait for them to be finished mourning. Val came to Jon while the pyre was still hissing. Your queen, she said without greeting, because breath used on courtesies was breath not used on stopping a fire, has told the Red Woman that the child will burn before dawn. Jon felt the world tilt a degree and right itself because it had to. What child? The one with the king's blood, Val said with a face made of contempt. She thinks it is the girl. Shireen's scarf had slipped. Her face was white. She looked at Jon and did not know whether to be brave or to scream. I didn't do anything, she said, which is all the prayer a child knows. I didn't. She will not be burned, Jon said, moving before the words had finished forming. In the yard, the Queen's men had begun the practical business of gathering wood and argument. They had built a half-pyre already. They worked quickly when no one stopped them. The Red Priestess stood where she could see the wood. Melisandre's face was not eager, only intent, the way a carpenter's is before a difficult join. Queen Celis stood with a paper in her hand that meant to be a warrant and was only a shape. Her eyes flickered with that righteous misery that comes when the hardest thing becomes the thing you most crave to do because it will make the world line up under your finger. "No," Jon said, and the yard heard it and shifted. Some men's hands went to hilts. Others went to mouths. "Your Grace," he said to Celis, "you will not light a child on fire on the wall I swore to keep. You will not do it in the north. You will not do it in any place where men I command can smell the smoke." "I command here," Celis said sharply, and thrust the paper at him as if paper could be a blade. "In the king's name." "I will command the fire," Melisandre said softly. "It is a cruel kindness. Light with light. We have no time for the slow movements of lesser hope." "I have seen." "I don't care what you have seen," Jon said, and his voice was quieter than the wind and so much more dangerous. "I care for what I will not see. A child screaming. I will hurt you if I must to stop it." He stepped between the wood and the Queen. "Touch that wood and I will throw you into it." The yard drew a breath. Queen's men looked to their leader and found themselves leaderless when leaders thought they had most authority. Tormund said, conversationally, for the yard to hear and consider, "I've killed a man for less than making a bit of dry wood dangerous." Melisandre's eyes went to the fire pot in a Queen's man's hand and then to Shireen, and Jon saw the long, calculating line of her thinking, the way she weighed salvation against sin and called the scale a lie if the numbers were wrong. For an instant he thought she would try to move around him like water. Then she made a slight bow that was all mouth and no spine. "Very well," she said, with a disappointment that held no apology. "We will burn a different brother." "I have no brothers," Celis said bitterly. "I have," Jon said, "and you will burn none of them either." It did not end in steel. It ended with a paper in Celis' hand ripped in half and then in quarters, and half the Queen's men too shocked to be offended and half ready to kill. And Davos stepped between men who had known better days and told them that they were not to have this fight because they would be dead in 2 days and should spend their strength on a better enemy. The Queen retreated into the Lord Commander's chambers with an outrage so vast it had become almost comfort. Melisandre stood and watched Jon until men grew uncomfortable at being in a yard where two strong things looked at each other and measured whether to bite. Later, in the warmth of the king's tower that had never liked being warm, Davos rubbed the missing fingers of his hand and shook his head. "She would have done it," he said. "Of course," Jon said. He sat with his back against a door as if expecting it to be opened from the other side by something that would not knock. Ghost's head was heavy on his foot. "I." Davos's voice went gently, as it did when he had to name ugliness. "She would have pretended it was not her that did it, that it was the true God or your king or fate or some poor bastard leech years gone. But she would have stood and watched and made it feel lighter for her. There are men who can do that with their sins." Jon closed his eyes because there was no use keeping them open when all he could see was a pyre that had not yet been lit. "She was your king's man," Jon said, because he had learned to keep a ledger even if he hated the ink. "She is my king's priest," Davos corrected. "I am my king's man." "And whose am I?" Jon asked the ceiling. "Yours," Davos said without hesitation. "And the North's." He rubbed at his mouth and took a breath that made his chest creak. "Hard home." "Hard home," Jon said. The sea near Eastwatch was a map drawn by a madman. Great floes of ice moved with a mind, grinding against one another with a noise like shields breaking. The wind came straight and rude and brought with it the taste of a far place in the water that had not seen men for 100 years. Wyman Manderley's ships looked suddenly too small and too proud for the work. Sailors cursed in half a dozen tongues and made signs against evil that contradicted one another and made a mess of protection. Jon met with Cotter Pike and found that his head had been made of salt and rope and curses. Pike had a Navy man's love of ships and a Navy man's contempt for anyone who thought the sea a thing that could be trusted. "Hardhome was dead before you were born," he said, squinting at the blued horizon. It will be dead after, but there are people there now. The sea will take them, and if the sea does not, something else will. We're fools to go. But we go. We go, Jon said. I've brought men with fire. We'll bring wood and oil too, and a prayer if there's breath to spare. Davos found a place on the same ship as Jon, not because he loved the sea that had taken his fingers and his sleep, but because he could never truly leave it. Val stood near the prow like a figurehead from a story about men who dared too much and were thanked by gulls. Tormund divided his time between the deck and the hold, where he bullied casks of oil into submission as if they were a raiding party. Ghost disliked the rolling deck but made no noise about it, settling with his jaws on his paws and a look that said he would bite the sea if it tried anything. They set out in a bright afternoon that turned into a gray that thickened and then into a dark that moved. The shore fell away. The air tasted like iron and fish and something older. The oars sank and rose and found a rhythm that kept men alive. When the night came to bite, it brought with it the sound of voices from the ice. Cackles, sing-song, the bending of wood. Men looked at one another because the sea should not have voices unless men were dying on it. Hardhome crouched on its cliff like an animal that had been hurt and did not want to show it. The old palisade was there but leaned wrong. Gaps showed where logs had been pried out, burned, eaten by a fire that had been more than a fire. The little beach below, where boats had once pulled up laughing, was a place of wreck now. Fires burned in 3 places and no more, and between the fires men moved like shadows that were not committed to the bodies that cast them. They came ashore to the smell of shit and fear. The people there had been many. They were less now. Women with children whose faces were chapped to bleeding stood near the fires and held pieces of one another's clothing, as if to be sure they still had enough rope to keep a person together. Men with eyes like fish, clear and startled, stood near the edge of the firelight and looked out at nothing. Go, Jon said. And men went because malice was absent and instruction is God where fear has eaten sense. Manderley's sailors threw down gangplanks that slid and were hauled up and down by men with rough hands that did not remember refinement and did not need to. Tormund waded into the shallows and took children in his arms and passed them up as if they were sacks of grain that had screamed earlier. Val walked through the crowd and said sharp things in the free folk's tongue that made men snap out of whatever spell had told them sitting would do. Jon found the man they followed at the far edge of the palisade, where the bones of the world rose into a steep face. He was a big man gone thinner than he should be and wore a ragged cloak made of a dozen different skins that did not agree with one another. His beard had grown without care. He had a cut on his cheek that had not been seen to and now was a country for fly eggs. He held a spear whose head showed black in the firelight. He had killed with it recently. "You're the wolf," he said when Jon came near. "The one with the name the South uses. My people call you the man who sees." "I see enough to know we must go," Jon said. "How many?" "1,000, the man said, drunk and sober at once on the number. "Maybe more, maybe less. It changes as night moves." "We take as many as we can pack," Jon said. "The rest on the second run. Fire where we can. Oil and pitch over the fence lines, and then we go." The man looked over Jon's head and then at Jon's hand on Longclaw's hilt. "They come at night," he said quietly. "And when they come, they do not come from where you believe men come. They come from your mother's stories. They come from under water and down a cliff and through a wall that looks like wood and isn't wood anymore. Then we go faster," Jon said. The night came up out of the water like breath. Men formed lines and carried burdens because there is dignity that work gives even where there is no food. Jon stood where a wall had been and swung Longclaw to point almost idly at an empty place where men would die later if he let them. He shouted and men moved, and there were moments in which the world looked like it could be coerced into sense. Then the first of the dead came over the palisade, and the world remembered itself. They moved badly and with purpose. They fell wrong and rose wrong, and their mouths did not remember how to shout. The living shouted for them. The first line crashed into men whose hands had learned to hold spears, and the spears went through bodies that did not stop. Oil went down and the fire after, and the night answered by becoming hotter and then angrier and then cold again, as if it could not make up its mind what killed best. and other rode the top of the palisade like a needle skittering along skin, light with weight that refused to admit it had substance. It slipped down into the yard, and the cold around it made men stand more upright without meaning to. JON moved toward it because his body had decided that was what it did. Longclaw met its pale spear, and the sound between them was thin and sharp and sounded like winter. JON pushed because he had learned that pushing is often all that separates your name from someone's blood. Behind him the beach became a riot of motion. Ropes thrown, boats shoved off, a woman screaming because she had lost count of children, and only partly because one of the ones she had counted was already gone. Davos's voice carried like a rope across water, saying the words useful to men on a ship. Here, together, hold, pull. Val's voice threaded through like a needle, stitching fear into courage. Tormund laughed because laughter keeps the breath from forgetting how. The other spear glanced along Longclaw's edge and left a seam of cold that made the sword look made of broken stars. JON stepped in and cut low. The thing danced away, and its foot made no sound on the boards of the walk. It struck again, and Longclaw caught and turned and slid, and then took the thing's arm off at the elbow. The arm fell to the boards and shattered into shining dust that the wind immediately tried to pretend it had been carrying all along. The other looked at the place where its arm had been and did nothing with its face. JON cut again, and the blade that had been a man's labor was the end of something that had never been a man. "Off," he heard himself say, and men listened because words at the right moment make sense sound like a physical thing. "Off now." Davos got the last boat to rock free with a shove from his hip that he would feel tomorrow, and set 3 oars together with one hand where his missing fingers made sense of anything complicated seem miraculous. A man on the shore turned and screamed and had no throat left. Val pulled a girl by the arm who wore a small bone in her ear and had forgotten her own name this morning and now remembered it suddenly simply because this woman had tugged her and said it. Ghost leapt a fence and then another and then hit a thing that had been a fisherman 2 days ago and brought it down and ripped and came away with his muzzle red and black. He ran back to JON and touched his knees and ran again to where a boy had fallen and men had stepped over him because men do that when their world shrinks to the width of their bodies. He growled and the men remembered shame and bent and picked the boy up by armpits and legs and brought him to the boat and shoved him in and pushed away a hand that was not a hand but something that moved like one and had no heat. They went. They left men on the shore because there are never enough boats. The fire crawled along a fence and then slowed and then simply sat, thinking. The cold put its finger in places where men had thought it could not find a way. On the last boat, JON stood with his feet braced and Longclaw's point down against the planking and watched the cliff while he breathed. Another lifted its head on the walkway and looked down across and found him. Its eyes were wrong. JON held the gaze because kings and monsters both take what you give them with your eyes. The boat dipped. A wave came. When the water went down again, the walkway was empty. He felt the cold then on his face, and understood that it had been there all along. On the sailback, men did not sing. Davos counted quiet. LY and wrote the number in his head because he could not bear to write it on paper. Val stood with her knuckles against her hips and stared toward a point she could see and others could not. "A tide has turned," she said, and when men asked which one she did not answer. Tormund laughed and then stopped and then laughed again because sometimes you must force your throat to remember. Eastwatch saw them and opened mouths and hands and arms and pulled people onto stone with a kind of gratitude that tasted like cowardice until you see that it is not. It is simply relief at the survival of strangers. JON stood on the quay and let the wind pull the sweat stiff on his skin and found that his hands were not shaking though a part of him wished to. Cotter Pike came to him with his eyes narrow because wind made them that way and because he disliked emotion greater than the sea. "We'll go again," he said resentfully, like a man agreeing to a chore he knows is his. "We will," JON said. "Not tonight. Fire and sleep. Tomorrow we load oil until the boats sit low like old men. And we cut pikes down so hard they don't remember being trees." "Your sense of humor is appalling," Pike said. "I like it." JON went back to Castle Black that night because the dead walked in his head, and the only cure he knew for bad dreams was to sit near stone he trusted and listen to men snore. Ghost lay on the rug in the Lord Commander's chambers and made the small huffing sounds that mean a wolf's brain is running across snow. Jon lay awake and listened to drugged silence from Queen Celis' rooms and a dripping of melted frost somewhere near and the thin breath of men who had not yet learned to sleep with fear in their bellies. Before dawn he dreamed. He stood in Winterfell's Godswood, though he was at Castle Black, and the weirwood's red leaves moved in a wind he did not feel on his face. The carved eyes opened and were not eyes, but something older wearing an eye's shape. A raven sat on a branch and cocked its head and croaked. Not a name, only the shape of a name, and that shape was North. He put his hand to the trunk, and the bark was rough and then smooth and then rough again under his palm, as if someone had been rubbing it for 100 years. A boy's laugh carried through the leaves, faint, as if from down a well. When he woke, the room was still night dark. Ghost was already standing, head toward the door, ears sharp. Jon got up, and his body felt older than it was and more honest. A raven waited in the yard when he went down, a fat black thing with an arrogance that suggested it had never failed at anything it had set out to do. Bowen Marsh held out the scrap of parchment with 2 fingers as if it would bite. "From Carhold," he said. His voice was thin and disapproving. He disliked being rescued. He disliked that Jon was the one who kept doing the rescuing. Jon read. Alice Karstark's hand looked as if it had been taught by a man who had used a knife for a pen, but the words were steady. Arnulf confessed his treason with his last breath, and that last breath smelled like the wine he had used to drown himself in when it turned on him. He tried to flee through the ice door and found the door stuck. Sigorn put his shoulder to it and found it less stuck. "I have a hall again. There are men who call me lady with their mouths and curse me with their eyes. I will have that too. Send a just man to sit in judgment with me. I will not have my house become small rubble because I was only stone in one way. I am married and therefore no more of being 2 things than I did 2 weeks ago." Jon read it twice. He passed it to Davos, who grunted, pleased by the way some things line up without pushing. "A just man," Davos said. "Wyman will send a ledger. Robet will send a beard. Send the little she-bear. She will send terror. It will settle the hall." "Lyanna Mormont?" Jon said. "She is a lord disguised as a small girl," Davos said, "and better at it than most lords." Val's raven came an hour later, and it was less polite. The scrap bore a strip of fur as if she had used the first thing to hand to tie it. "The queen has not burned a tree since you shouted. She will burn a man if given a reason. There are more giants here than the queen likes. Your watch crooked man tried to tell one to move out of the wind. He was wrong to do it. The giant made paste of him. Men were calmer after that. The wind does not move for a crown. It moves when it wants to. Bring more pitch. Bring more patience. I have none." "Your friends write the way they speak," Celis said from a balcony unseen, tone wounded. "With no respect." "They write with time," Jon said. They went again to Hardhome and again, until the place smelled of smoke and rotten fish and effort. They brought out hundreds and lost dozens and brought out dozens and lost hundreds because the sea took what it would, and the dead took more, and some men refused to become numbers and threw themselves into the fire to take choice back. On the last run, when the wind changed to an angle it had not held for months and a wave came in wrong and the ship heaved, Theon Greyjoy stood on a plank walk between boat and wall and held rope in both hands and knew, finally and without ornament, the weight of something outside himself. He did not fall. A spear hit the rope below his hands and the rope twanged and his palms bled, and he held anyway until men had crossed and then he let go. He had not asked permission to come. He only came. Later, in the galley, he vomited and laughed, and no one looked too long at him. When the last boat pushed off and the cliff had become a wall of white figures and the sound of their stillness had grown louder than men had made, Jon looked up and thought, and did not speak, that they had angered the dark in a way that the dark would not forget. Ghost turned his head and then turned it back and pressed against Jon's thigh. Val's hand touched his shoulder, Br. Eve, as if to say what words could not say without making the air too heavy. Eastwatch stank of fish and victory. Stannis's letters came like small iron weights in sacks of words. Massey had sailed with contracts in his pockets and hopes he was not qualified to hold. The South sent its insolences, stamped lion and rose. The river lords sent polite replies that meant nothing and everything. Live long enough and we'll decide. The Vale sent silence, which was better than being told to mind their own snow. From White Harbor came a note that said simply, "There are strange sails on the sunset sea, and they fly a crow's eye." Wyman had drawn an eye beside the words, and it looked angry and foolish at the same time. "Euron," Davos said with dislike that had the dignity of long knowledge. "Pray to any god you like that he stays far as his name." "He has a horn," Val said, without knowing how she knew. "Men who blow horns blow themselves hollow. Sometimes the wind comes out of them and makes them look bigger than they are. The wind does not care. It will go the other way." Jon slept little and ate less. He burned letters he should have answered and answered letters he should have burned and took what the day allowed him, which was often only a chance to keep men from doing something that would kill them sooner than winter would. He mended small quarrels in the yard with the same seriousness as large, and men were puzzled and then grateful in ways that tasted like better food. He listened to two thens explain the wrongness of a particular witch's mark on a boy's wrist, and then to a queen's man explain the wrongness of not burning the boy entirely. He told them both he was tired and that if they thought the boy's wrist could bring the others through the gate, perhaps he would tie it to a spear and throw it at them. They stopped talking and started doing work. Asha Greyjoy asked to see him, and he sent for her because putting it off would only sharpen whatever bone she meant to prod him with. She came in under guard, and she made the guards look foolish by the simple act of walking between them with more dignity than a queen's procession. "Wolf," she said, grinning without mirth, "they say you saved my brother and did not hang him with his own guts. That makes you either merciful or a poor ironborn." "He is not ironborn," Jon said. "He is himself." "Still merciful then," Asha said. She folded her arms.
Euron sighs.
"My people like him because he promises them gold and fear and a better song to die to. He will come to your shores because your shores are where songs come from now. Tie my brother to a chair if you like, but if you want something useful from him, ask him where our uncle keeps his heart. It is in a box so small a child could hold it. And ask him if he knows where the girl we call Brother's Bride hides. He will know. He knows everything that hurts him." She sighed. "I want him back. I do not know why. That is a bad habit." She looked around the room with curiosity that made Jon feel as if he were being measured for a suit and a coffin simultaneously. "You make this place less dead. Help me keep it that way," Jon said. "I would," Asha said, surprised. "And if I run, I will run north. There is nothing south that cannot be convinced to betray you by a wine cup. Here, the cups freeze. Back at Winterfell the spring took and didn't, the way spring does in a bad year. The ground went from white to brown to white again, as if indecisive. Rickon learned to sit for longer than 10 minutes without kicking a table leg. He learned the names of men who would die for him and those who would not die for him but would not betray him either, and the difference. Lady Dustin held court in a chilly chamber with a brazier always going and decided small matters with cruel efficiency and great matters with a smile that gave nothing away. Wyman sent food and men and jokes. Robert Glover wore a path between the great hall and the stables that could have guided a blind man. Bran Stark, under a hill men had stopped naming a long time ago, opened his eyes and looked through 1,000 leaves and found Winterfell on a clear morning when frost made everything simple. He watched his brother stand in a yard he had run through as a child and put his hand on a boy's head and make a joke so bad it became a warmth. Bran smiled without moving his mouth. A leaf fell in a wood hundreds of miles away. He watched it because watching is often all that remains. He reached out along the long white roots toward a place where water touched stone and wolves pressed noses. The roots did not do what he asked. They did something else. He let them. There was time. There was none. Arya Stark, whose name was not Stark today, stood in a doorway in Braavos wearing a dress that fit wrong and counted coins. She looked at a wall where she had carved marks for a list long ago and rubbed a thumb across where a name might have been. The sea whispered the way all seas whisper, as if telling jokes badly. A woman came and told her to be no one. Arya nodded and thought of a wolf with red eyes in a hall of gray light and did not smile where it could be seen. At the wall, the ravens came with worse news arranged neatly. Rattleshirt had been killed by a giant after trying to stab him. which had the air of a thing that had been inevitable since time began. Queen Celis had decided that giants were demons. The giants had decided that queens were not worth learning the word for. Tormund stood between and shrugged a lot. Melisandre stared into a blaze and came away with ash under her eyes that looked like coal. She said, in a voice like a hand on a man's chest, "I see snow. I see a wall. I see a river on fire. I see a wolf with a crown of black iron. I see a boy with a dog's heart. I see the end of wood." She looked then at JON as if expecting him to explain what she had already decided to know. He shook his head. "You see because you carry a lant. RN into a dark room," he said. "Do not tell me the lantern made the room." She smiled, slow and real. "We will quarrel until the end," she said. "If we're lucky," JON said. He rubbed his eyes with thumb and forefinger. "We need obsidian. The fist of the first men has some buried. Sam wrote it."
"Send men."
"I will go," Theon said, and men started because he had chosen to be unseen until now. "I know the way." He did not really, but he wished to. "You will stay," JON said. "Your feet cannot carry you there yet. You have stood enough for this month." He looked at Melisandre. "Will you go?" Her head turned. The idea seemed to amuse her. "If I go, the boy's mother will burn the castle around my absence," she said. "Send the queen's men. They will come back eager to believe." "Send the mountain men," Tormund suggested. "They will come back with what you want and a story that will make them fat all winter." JON sent a mixed band and a letter with them and a sack of coin for the man who had written about the find. He did not expect to see the coins again. He saw the obsidian. Came back in a bag sewn tight as if it were something that might leak. The men who carried it did not look at it as if it were treasure. They looked at it as if it had turned them into strangers to their own hands. "Make arrowheads," JON said, and the smith sucked through his teeth and said that he could and could not, that glass and iron were cousins who did not speak. "Then teach them to be polite," JON said, and the man stared and then laughed and then stopped and decided to try. When they fought the others the next time, under a moon so bright and cold its light was a blade, the arrows made from glass flew strangely and struck strangely and made a sound that men began to love. The things in the snow broke in ways that satisfied something that had been longing for that sound since men had begun counting. JON killed another of the long cold ones with long claw and looked down at the powder like bone meal and thought of Eamon's voice, low and amused, talking about walls made of what remains when the river goes. At Winterfell, Rickon sat his first small justice without JON at his side, and found himself saying to a man who had beaten his wife in the belief that fences end at skin, "You will go to Carhold and chop wood until your hands know better. Bring the chopped wood back here. If you return late, you will sleep in the snow outside the gate. If you strike anyone on the road, I will have you dig a pit and then lie down in it. I am told the ground is soft enough now that the digging will not kill you. It might be your only mercy." The man bowed his head. Afterwards, in his room, Rickon bent and put his forehead to Shaggy Dog's and shook. He did not cry. He learned that not crying is a relief for other people and a theft from yourself. Stannis Baratheon wrote from Winterfell in a hand so tight it looked like something bound. He said that Justin Massey had written that he had found men in the south who liked coin better than weather. He said that Lord Karstark died as a traitor and that men will argue which is worse, death or being called so. He said that he had considered marching south and then had looked at the wall and found himself angry that it was there to be kept by other men. He said that what must be beaten into men had to be beaten into himself first. He said, in an almost careless postscript, that he was proud. Davos watched JON read that letter and tapped the table with the stumps of his fingers in a small rhythm. "He is a better man when he has someone to be angry at, that isn't you," he observed. "I can oblige him," JON said. "He doesn't need more practice," Davos said gently. Word came over the Frostfangs that a great many dead had gathered on a lake that had not existed the year before and had frozen in a way that seemed too fast to be properly named. They moved at night. They moved when no man watched. Birds died in the trees near them for no reason anyone could give. A wildling girl with hair like the pelt of something too quick to catch told the story in a voice like hurt snow. Jon sent men with oil and rope and patience and told them not to be heroes. They took too long and came back fewer and said that they had done nothing and had done everything they could. He told them both were true. Theon found Jane Poole on a day when the sky had become a lid and the wind pressed it down hard. She sat in a corner of the odd little moss garden near the hot springs where a trickle of steam keeps green even in winter. She had taken to coming there when men were loud. He sat by her without speaking. She did not run. "I am Jane Poole," she said eventually, flat, as if she had decided at last to say the words out where they could stand up on their own. "I am not Arya Stark. I am not anyone's wife. I am not a whore. I am Jane Poole." He nodded. "I am Theon Greyjoy," he said. "I am not Reek. I am not a prince. I am not dead. I am Theon Greyjoy." The repetition wore the words smooth. "If I am not careful," he added with a laugh that was also a cough, "I will be boring." She smiled, a small thing like a coin found under an old plank. "Let us be boring," she said. "Let us live long enough to be so boring we forget how to be interesting. Then men will write songs about us and get it wrong." "I don't want songs," he said. "I want the truth," she said, and then laughed. And the laugh made the ghosts in his head sit for a minute and listen. Summer came on the calendar and not in the fields. The North stores, patched from the Bolton's hoard and Manderley's largesse and the free folks' surprising efficiency with nettles and salted meat, held enough to get men through to a year they could believe in. The Watch's ravens came less panicked and more full of the sort of detail that shows men are thinking. Positions, numbers, odd tracks that could be read a dozen ways. Val sent word that one of the giants had died and the others had sung in a way that made the wall shake. Melisandre sent word that her fires had shown her a man with a spear of light and that he had been eaten by darkness with no sound. She said this calmly. Stannis sent a list of men she wished punished for sacrilege that had to be read 3 times before anyone could find what the sacrilege had been. Jon read it once. He threw it in the brazier. He wrote back, "Thank you for your vigilance. The wall stands. We stand." He had learned that some lies were simply the truth with less blood on them. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley stood in his hall with his rings and laughed until he coughed and then waved a servant away when the servant fussed. "He writes like a man," Wyman said. "He is a boy in places. That is good. That is how you get men to follow you. If you are always a man, they grow tired. If you are always a boy, they grow contempt. He is both." "Are we sending any more ships?" his steward asked, practical. "We are sending more ships," Wyman said, "and fewer men who talk too much." He licked a finger and smoothed a place on the letter that had wrinkled, as if smoothing the paper could smooth the world. "Tell them to write their names twice. The sea eats names." Bran slept and dreamed of a wolf with a black iron crown and woke and did not tell the 3-eyed crow because the crow would only say that crowns are for men who need other men to tell them who they are. He looked through the tree into a yard where a boy ran with a stick and a girl shouted at him not to trip. He looked through another and saw a hall where a man he did not know raised his cup and called the northward wind a blessing, as if the wind would care and change direction for a toast. He sent a bird, but the bird dropped into snow in a wood and became only a bird again. In Bravos, a girl carried a tray and did not spill and heard a man whisper his debts and knew how he would die and did not flinch. She went to a place where faces hung and did not pick any. She stood outside the house of black and white and looked at the ugly statue of the stranger across the canal and almost laughed, because for once a god looked exactly like itself. "Your brother lives," she whispered to the water, "because whispers do not belong to anyone and thus are safe." The horn blew 3 times on a night that had begun with a promise of quiet. Castle Black shuddered as if remembering how to be afraid. Men woke in hammocks and on the floor and under tables and went to where their hands remembered to go. Jon's body was moving before his mind had decided on any particular thing. He took Longclaw in his fist and ran up into the wind. Ghost was already ahead of him, a white sprint that made the darkness cautious. Melisandre stood on the wall with her hair like fire in a bad dream. Stannis came with a cloak pulled tight and a mouth full of prayers she didn't know the words to. They came out of the woods below like a wave that had forgotten how to break. The watchtower's fires guttered and then surged. Oil went down. A Obsidian arrows went out. Men shouted and then swallowed the shout and let their arms move as if their bones had replaced commands. The first of the others slid over the ground like mist with purpose. The whites behind them moved like a field that had suddenly discovered it had legs. JON found himself beside Tormund, and Tormund grinned a battle grin that looked like death trying to put on a cheerful face. "You fight like a man with too many brothers," Tormund shouted over the noise. "You fight as if you can kill the worst thing by killing the thing looking at you. Doesn't everyone?" JON shouted back, and cut. They held. They fell back, then held again. One bent and scooped a handful of the dead and threw them into others as if throwing rocks into a pond, and the dead fell and then stood and then fell again when oil found them. A Queen's man laughed too loudly and then went quiet forever, and a then who had once believed in nothing but walls stood in front of him and did not let the thing that had killed him pass. Melisandre spoke words that made the flame go up and then up again in the same pot, as if time had lost its place. Val ran along the wall and shouted at archers to aim lower, because the thing that is different about the dead is not that they move wrong but that they keep moving. Cotter Pike's voice cut like a rope and tied men to what they needed to do. When the thing that had led them, the tall cold that wore a shape only because it needed men to be afraid, came within reach, JON met it. Longclaw answered it. The air went thin. For a moment the wall was only the place where steel learned to be honest. JON cut high and the thing parried and the sound was like glass on rock. He stepped in and it stepped back and the world narrowed until snowflakes looked like characters on a page. He went low then and found knee and took it and then cut again and found that the thing had an edge and then had no edge and then was powder, and the men around him cried out, not triumph, something darker and lighter. He didn't have time to name it. He forced breath into his chest and turned. They spent the night. By dawn the yard was a history of short decisions. Men bled and lived and bled and died. The cold retreated because the sun had happened somewhere else and the world remembered to be itself. JON stood on the wall and looked north and saw nothing and knew that was the lie. He wiped Longclaw on his cloak and did not apologize to the cloak. Ghost leaned against him. Davos came and stood silently. Tormund spat over the side and said something filthy about winter. Val came and said, "You are not done." "I am never done," JON said. "Good," Val said. "You are not too proud about it." He wrote to Winterfell and told Rickon to hold his chair and not to bite anyone who did not deserve it. He wrote to Wyman and told him that his ships had done more than feed the SE. He wrote to Alice and said he would send Lyanna Mormont north to judge with her, and then he did. He wrote to Stannis and said simply, "They came. We held. We will hold again." He wrote to Celis and said nothing. He wrote to Melisandre and asked, without sarcasm, what her fires saw that might help him keep men alive. She wrote back on a scrap of leather as if paper had suddenly offended her. "The fire shows fire," she wrote. "It shows men bending toward it and men bending away. It shows the wolf on the wall, and the boy with the crown of iron, and the girl with the coin, and the tree that remembers everything. It shows a river of swords. It does not show an end. I do not think it knows what one looks like." "Honest," Davos said, reading over his shoulder. "I like her less when she is honest." "So do I," JON said. He breathed in, long and ragged. "We build. We sharpen. We hold. We will be bored again soon," he added, thinking of Jane Poole. "If we are lucky." Winterfell breathed. The gods would drank. The south looked north with eyes narrowed and calculations sharpened and wrote letters that meant less each week. The sea brought ugly ships and good ones. The free folk built square houses they did not love and learned to love them because they kept wind out. The Thens liked the walls. The Manderleys liked the fish. The Umbers liked the fighting. The Queen's men liked the way their prayers felt in their mouths. The old gods liked nothing and everything, if liking is a word you can fit over something that has watched ice move for 10,000 years. JON stood one dusk at the top of the wall, where the world looks as if it might fall off if you breathe. Ghost stood with him. Below, men moved, a small number of pieces on a board too large to carve. Tormund came and put his hands on the ice as if introducing himself to it. "I had a woman once," he said conversationally, "who said she would leave me if I didn't stop talking about the end of the world, She left me. The world didn't end. I think about her when the world looks like ending. It makes me laugh. Jon smiled. Come to Winterfell when you are tired of laughing at the cold, he said. We'll find you a stool that doesn't break. I break the stool, Tormund said, offended. No stool breaks me. They watched the night come. They listened to the far nothing. They did the thing men have always done when the dark gathers and all the big decisions are somewhere else. They stood their watch and kept their fire and did not allow themselves the easy luxury of despair. The wind lifted, like a hand smoothing a boy's cowlick. The stars came out, a handful, ungenerous and honest. Below them, in a room where the heat had taken hold and would not be shoved out, a boy slept with his hand on a wolf's ear. In a hall of stone, an old woman dreamt of sewing and woke with blood in her mouth and laughed because even old women bleed sometimes. In a ship heading north against better judgment, a man thought about a horn and chose not to blow it. In a city of lords, a woman put on a smile and counted the steps between her and whatever safety lay behind lies. Jon did not know any of that then. He knew only the line of the world under his boots and the shape of the cold on his teeth and the solid presence at his side that would not let him fall asleep standing. He knew the work that would come with dawn. He knew the long patience of stone. He knew the small crack at the corner of his mouth that would not heal because he kept smiling when men needed it and sometimes when he did not. When the next raven came, it brought nothing men could not have guessed. More dead north, fewer east, fewer still west. An odd light seen at the second watch that might have been a trick of a man's tired eyes. He fed the bird and stroked its feathers and let it go. It rose into the air like an idea getting away from you. He watched it go until it was a dot. He pulled his cloak closer. He turned and went down into the noise and steam and sweat. He had been boy and was man and would be both as long as the world required it. He did not wear his name like a crown. He wore it like a tool. Ghost followed as he always did. The wind dropped. The wall did not fall. The night closed its hand and they stayed.